Good that we are meeting here today to discuss a very interesting ongoing project of the Institute of Climate Studies. We have Ambassador Nansuri with us. We have, of course, Ambassador Shokan, the Director of the Institute of Chinese Studies, and so many other people. It's a great pleasure to welcome you. The China presence in Africa is a very significant presence, going back, of course, to the famous railway line of the 1970s, the Tanzania Zambia line. But of course, that was a very different ball game, and now it's completely different. And rather than reacting one way or the other, it's always better to look at it from the point of view of a good researcher, looking at the aspects. What are the pluses? What are the costs? What are the full range of activities, the full range of effects, intended and unintended effects. And I think that when I look at the list of people, and more importantly, thing that they're looking at, the summary of the draft paper that has been prepared by the ICS, it does look that it has been really looked at across the full spectrum. It has been looking at. At Nehru Memorial, our job is, we have of course our own fellows here. Full strength will be of 35 fellows here, between senior fellows and junior fellows. In addition, of course, we are a platform for research. Anybody wanting to do research on contemporary affairs, contemporary India, etc., is always welcome here, and they do. A lot of people do come here. In fact, it's rare that we have a book written on contemporary India specifically, that the researcher, whoever she is, whoever he is, from anywhere in the world, has not consulted our archive at some point or the other, or other records. I'll give this as an example. Increasingly, we are now, in the last few years, focusing a little more on international affairs and issues to do with the world outside India directly. But of course, nothing is outside in the sense that you are so interlinked to the world. If you look at our trade to GDP ratio, our trade to GDP ratio is higher than China's trade to GDP ratio. And also a function, of course, the fact that the GDP is much smaller. Numbers always can be misread. But still, we are very well linked to the world, and therefore, looking at effects of what's happening in the rest of the world, definitely did have an impact on India. And we've been encouraging such a work, collaborating it, and also hosting events on this side. I will not take more time, but I'll just say that it was at the moment a great pleasure to work with or support in our own little way, very little way, just the premises, nothing very much. But at least in this little way, the ICS's effort in studying China's Africa engagement and Indian perspective. With this, let me, of course, request you to switch off your mobile phones, because I'm sure for most researchers there's nothing very urgent that can't wait for the next few hours. Leaving that aside, let me now request our chair, Ambassador Nansuri, distinguished fellow of the Delhi Policy Group, to deliver his inaugural remarks.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Shakti, and thank you, Ashok, for inviting me for this very important roundtable discussion. Important essentially because we have a team of excellent researchers who have done a fine piece of work on empirical work, on the ground work, and Chinese investments in two critical countries, Tanzania and Kenya. I think the reason why this work is important is not simply because of an effort to assess what the Chinese have been doing in East Africa, but also to learn lessons for our own experiences. I mean, we are equally large aid and development partners for Africa. If you actually look at the statistics in terms of pro rata, then you will find that India is not far behind China, whether in trade terms or in investment terms. The difference is Chinese investments are much more in the face, they are big infrastructure projects, but we are also now in the business of doing big infrastructure projects in China. So I think the lessons that you've learned would apply as much to Indian investments if you leave the debt aspect out of it. So I think from that perspective, it's very important that this work has been done. I'm only a little disappointed that people from either CII, FICCI and the Ministry of External Affairs are not here. That is, I think they are in the list. because these are lessons which will be very relevant for DPA in MEA. They're extremely relevant for CII because, as you know, CII has been doing with Africa since 2000. Because CII has been doing in collaboration with MEA and Ministry of Commerce and now Exim Bank since 2005 an annual meeting with African leaders and African business. And this has grown over the years and is actually a very successful way of doing business with Africa and the African countries. CII also does 3 or 4 regional meetings in Africa every year. The outcome of your work should also be disseminated to them. Maybe you can make a special presentation. It's also relevant for the DPA of MEA. And I think this kind of work, if you actually do a couple of such projects in West Africa, will help Ministry of External Affairs prepare the next summit, the 4th India-Africa Forum Summit, in that sense better. Now, I'm not going to, as I said to Veda earlier when we started, I'm not going to make comments on your outcome of your discussions in the beginning. I only want to make one general remark. That is that a lot of the downsides of Chinese involvement in Africa, whether it be in trade or other terms, a lot of it has already been taken on board by the Chinese. And this is reflected very clearly in the outcome of FOCAC 2018, which happened last year in September. If you study the documents of FOCAC, you will find a conscious effort by the Chinese to address the very major downsides of their partnership with Africa. There again, there are lessons to be learned by us. The fundamental difference is most of Indian investments in Africa are private sector oriented, and most government money is loans through Exim Bank, but for projects which are identified by our African partners. We do no projects in Africa which we want to do because we want to exploit any particular aspect of any particular African economy. I think that's the fundamental difference. But it's a learning process for us, it's a learning process for the Chinese. And I think it would be a mistake to think that the Chinese are not learning from their mistakes. So I'll leave my opening remarks for that, but to congratulate ICS and the team led by Veda, I think, for doing an outstanding work. I've seen the outcome of your work last night. I think it's better you share it with everybody. And then we will go into the comments, and we'll also take on board comments from the experts who are present here. I have several other comments to make, but I will make them after we do your presentation. Thank you again, Shakti and Ashok, for inviting me to chair this very important meeting.
Thank you. Thank you. In fact, Exim Bank, that Africa thing was held very recently over here. The one Ambassador Narayan mentioned was held, I think, at ISC or somewhere else very recently, at Angola. 17. I remember. It was. Anyway, Ashok, over to you to tell us about the project.
Thanks, Shakti. Well, Ambassador Narayan, Mr. Krishna, Sanjay Pulipaka, Ambassador Belinda, Kenya, and all distinguished participants, welcome to this roundtable discussion on Chinese engagement in Africa, perspectives from India. We are particularly happy to do it at NMML in partnership with Shakti and his team, because Nehru Memorial Museum and Library is such a strong, vibrant hub for academic activities. So you bring real value to a project like this by hosting it. And I'm also very delighted that Nalin is chairing it. He has very strong background both in China and Africa. The China background is of course well known as ambassador to China in other capacities. Africa also, as Secretary West in MEA, as Director General of ICWA, he has done a lot of work. So we are looking forward to your comments on the projects later this afternoon. Shakti asked me to introduce the project. As you know, today our discussions will be in 2 parts. First part, as Chair suggested, will be to present to you the preliminary findings of this research project on infrastructure development in Africa, an examination of Tanzania and Kenya. It was initiated by the Institute of Chinese Studies in April last year, just over 11 months ago. And what really differentiates this project from many other initiatives is the researchers we have, it's a young, multi-country, multicultural research team, and I would like to, especially felicitate them for the, moving ahead so quickly on the project. We have Dr. Veda Vaidyanathan. She is a research associate with ICS. She has a strong background on China and Africa. In fact, PhD thesis is also related to that. Then we have Mr. Juman Gomera. Gomera is a policy analyst with Prime Minister's Office in Tanzania, and presently is taking time off to complete his PhD with Peking University. And Gomera is going to defend his PhD shortly within the next few days. So all the best to Gomera. I'm sure it will be cakewalk for you. Then we have Thongbu. She is China consultant with Sino-African Center of Excellence, both emerging markets group in Nairobi. And we have two of right research interns. One is Uday, he's here, Uday Kanpurkar with ICS, and Sunaina Bose. Sunaina is there, she's with IIT Madras, but she has been involved with us closely. Shortly, they will be presenting their research findings, three of them, Veda, Gomera and Thongbu. And then we'll have Q&A session, and the chair will step in with more substantive remarks at that time. And then second part of this morning's discussion will be a roundtable discussion, and we are very happy to have with us academics, scholars, practitioners, and members of industry. Colleagues from CII could not come today because they happen to have their annual general body meeting on 4th and 5th, so they are all preoccupied with that. But we are closely engaged with them, so we are interacting with them separately. Now, and we are also happy to have the High Commissioner from Kenya present here today with us. Now, as you know, Africa is rising. This is one very exciting story which is unfolding. Growth and dynamism in Africa, the fact that some of the fastest growing economies in the world belong to the African continent today, and the fact that the average age of Africa is less than 20 as compared to something like 45 or so in Europe. So there is a huge potential and opportunity for the African continent. As part of this larger African story, we have the remarkable trajectory of China's rapidly growing association with the continent. Since 2009, China has emerged as the largest trading partner of Africa. Last year, bilateral trade turnover between China and countries in Africa was in excess of $204 billion US. I understand that there are more than 10,000 Chinese companies operating in Africa, and a large number of young energetic business people are traveling to Africa in search of opportunities, chasing their own dreams. The commonly mentioned figure for Chinese in Africa is now 1 million, so it's a large contingent which is there. And China has also come to acquire a sizable investment portfolio in Africa and has a significant presence in African industry, agriculture, manufacturing, health, education and infrastructure. But what is most visible is China's involvement in infrastructure segment, where Africa, like the rest of the developing world, has a large shortfall, a large deficit that needs to be plugged. Chinese companies, both state-owned enterprises and those from private sector, are rapidly taking up infrastructure projects in the continent, backed up by loans from China, from Exim Bank and other sources, and supported by Chinese state. I think this is an important point to note, that kind of support let's see from the Chinese state. Now, estimates from aid data suggest that China has built over 3,000 infrastructure projects in Africa, while official Chinese statistics indicate that China has developed about 5,000 kilometers of roads and railways in the continent. But narratives about China and Africa are really conflicting. On one side, there are reports and perceptions about Chinese companies filling in the infrastructure gap in Africa, stepping in where others are less prepared to do, and giving options to African nations. And there are counter perceptions which are also quite strong and fairly widely shared, including in Africa. Now these perceptions and concerns are about opaqueness of Chinese operations, growing debt burden of African countries and African companies, lopsided contracts which are sometimes not so readily understood by some of the African partners, excessive reliance on labor imported from China, and China deploying its excess capacity in Africa. While some of these concerns may have basis in facts, so what is very important to recognize that Chinese companies have created essential infrastructure in Africa, and that's something which is broadly welcomed. They have done a lot to do that. Now, our young researchers will be presenting their preliminary research findings. They have explored, many research questions, including what are the corporate strategies and modes of operation that are unique to Chinese companies in Africa. How are the Chinese stakeholders navigating increased Chinese engagement, and so on and so forth. I will not try to anticipate their presentation, but I did manage to get a sneak preview of the report and the presentation. So I will say something with confidence that they have very carefully avoided the pitfall of stereotypes, because there are stereotypes abound when it comes to Chinese engagement in Africa. There are polemical perceptions about what China is doing in Africa. They have sought to avoid that. They have instead opted for an evidence-based approach, what Chair referred to as empirical work. So there's a lot of focus on that let facts speak for themselves, rather than starting with certain conclusions and finding facts to substantiate those conclusions. I think they have avoided that. And what brings depth and value to their study are the case studies that they have carried out. They have undertaken 6 case studies relating to Dar es Salaam and Bagamoyo ports, Zanzibar airport, Mombasa Nairobi standard gauge railway, Matwara gas project, national ITC backbone in Tanzania. So these 6 case studies or projects which are relatively large, they have undertaken. Now their project is also differentiated from a whole lot of other studies by the fact that there was a very strong component of field studies. Veda alone, in fact, she spent nearly a month last year in September, October, traveling in Kenya and Tanzania. If I remember correctly, she conducted nearly 3 dozen together, 3 of them together. They conducted nearly 3 dozen interviews. Now these interviews or this work provides the real substance of the research work, the project they have undertaken. And that they have also made it possible for our researchers to validate their findings on the ground and impart granular details to the macro picture. So they have done the literature review, no doubt about it, but they have not, they've gone well beyond that. They try to find from the ground level up what's the picture emerging. It's nevertheless a relatively modest exercise because given resources at our command, time that was available, what they've undertaken is limited, and as Chair pointed out, there are findings which will need to be validated with the more detailed work as we go along. But I'm happy that a young team has not shied away from arriving at some bold conclusions. For instance, about the correlation between Chinese construction and African modern industrialization. To what extent, Chinese construction activities have aided industrialization or export-led growth strategy in Africa. But they have some fairly firm conclusion. I'll let them spell out those conclusions. And then again, this afternoon, after they have made their presentation and we have Q&A session and comments from chair and others, the second segment will be roundtable discussion. And this is going to be really beneficial in this discussion. As chair said, we can also look at the comparative aspect. So that was not the main focus of the research project, which is mainly on what's happening in Tanzania and Kenya infrastructure segment. But there will be very valid, convergent comparisons. There will be important, pointers and lessons for Indian entities which are pursuing projects and other opportunities in Africa. And as Chair said, India has a very large presence, historically large presence in Africa, which is growing, which is getting renewed, which is getting new dimensions today. So I believe that exercise will also be advanced by discussions that we're going to have today. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to very productive discussions this morning. Thank you.
Just before I hand over, let me tell, in case there's somebody outside who wants to be part of this proceeding, we're webcasting it live on our own website and on Facebook Live. That's what I'll just pass the information.
Thank you, Ashok. I'm saying without wasting more time, I now request Veda to make her presentation and for her and colleagues to do that. And I suggest you make it as detailed as you can, because the focus is your work. Our comments will follow. So whichever order you want to follow. Can we in the right put those lines down?
Lines down.
Who are the lines that are issued?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. Alexa suggested this in many accounts is a pilot study. Everything from the team to the methodology. It's a first attempt at a very ambitious hypothesis. So let me just walk you through the timeline of the study. In April, I joined ICS and we started hit the ground running. We started putting together an in-depth literature of review of secondary sources that were looking largely at China-Africa engagement, but also at infrastructure. We started writing the project proposal as we were reading reviews. In May, we continued writing the project proposal and we started approaching potential funders in Delhi. In June, we started putting together a database of Chinese construction projects in Tanzania, Kenya. We were trying to put together information like which were the companies involved, what was the extent of capital they were investing, what was the nature of the infrastructure, what is the current status.
Can you just blow it out? Can you increase the size? थोड़ा सा font बढ़ा दीजिए. Projection थोड़ा बहुत projection. The rest of it is actually bigger font. Don't worry. This is only the first part.
And then in July, in June, we conceptualized the research methods. We made an exhaustive wish list of if we could go to the field and if we could interview, who would be interviewed. Started putting together that list. In July, we identified institutional partners with Tong's research organization, the Sino-Africa Center for Excellence, and with REPOA in Tanzania. We applied for research permits. We started our team conversations at that point. And then the team came together that month. After that, we identified Indian infrastructure companies operating in Tanzania and Kenya and who we could talk to in the field. We interviewed Exim Bank officials in Mumbai because Exim Bank had come out with an excellent report on infrastructure building in Africa. We started contacting Tanzanian and Kenyan stakeholders. We started sending out drafting questionnaires. In September and October, like the director mentioned, we conducted fieldwork. So we went first to Nairobi. From Nairobi, we took the Chinese-built SGR to Mombasa. from Mombasa back to Nairobi, then to Dar es Salaam, from Dar es Salaam to Dodoma, back to Dar es Salaam, and then to Zanzibar and back. So during the course of this fieldwork, we identified, okay, which are the case studies we wanted to focus more on, and it largely was projects that we thought were we had access to and we had a comprehensive idea of. We talk more about it in the next slide. In November, once we got back, we transcribed all the interviews. We conducted a few of the follow-up interviews to fill up some of the blanks. We prepared the field notes. We came up with a framework of what the report is going to look like. And then we did the task of dividing the work among ourselves of who would write what. And then the next 3 months, we proceeded to write the first draft. So right now, as we are disseminating these preliminary findings, we have a very rough draft. And we're hoping to send this out to a few experts. We're hoping that conversations from the roundtable today, comments from there can be incorporated into the report. And we're hoping to publish by July. So these were the two main questions we had when we were in the field, right? So what are the corporate strategies and modes of operation that are unique to Chinese companies in Africa? And how is the African stakeholder navigating increased Chinese engagement? So like Sir mentioned, because the China-Africa realm has had so much coverage in news, journalists, books coming out, there were all of these stereotypes that existed. So our preliminary aim was to first understand before even making a judgment. So why did we pick Kenya and Tanzania? I mean, I don't think I need to explain to the audience that they are major economies in Africa. They're also strong partners of China. There are very regular high-level visits to both of these countries. China is also the largest trading partner for both these countries. There are over 400 Chinese enterprises operating in Kenya and over 500 in Tanzania. And I'm told that these numbers are very tiny, that there's actually, the numbers are much higher. They also house some of the biggest Chinese infrastructure projects. Kenya has already been identified as the go-to place for VRI in Africa. These two countries also house the Dar es Salaam port, the Mombasa port, and they provide gateways to other landlocked countries in the continent. And from an Indian perspective, it is home to members of the Indian diaspora. They are our traditional partners. But most importantly, we picked Tanzania and Kenya because we knew we would have access to stakeholders. And so every project that we picked, we not only tried to talk to the African officials who were running the project, but to the operators, the Chinese contractors. So every project we've talked to multiple stakeholders. The next question was why infrastructure? So like I mentioned earlier, you can analyze China-Africa from any lens possible, and we picked infrastructure as a variable to study. And Gomera will explain.
Yeah, thank you, Veda. As we've seen in the background of the study, so the methodology was a post-pragmatic approach, where we have a general broad of theoretical, and then after having the theoretical approach, then we went to the fieldwork. So basically, I'm not going to repeat what has been said by the director of the institute, as well as Veda, that the increase of stock of infrastructure generates economic growth. So we have explored a bunch of literature that supports that infrastructure development supports economic growth and as well as economic development. So in some theories, they suggest that infrastructure development can cut down transaction costs and therefore improve business environment in the country, and therefore has a positive impact. So from the demand side, we have already known that from the opening remarks that Africa is a continent that infrastructure is highly needed. We have a huge infrastructure deficit, and in some points, in some studies, they estimate that Africa needs around maybe 170 billion each year in order to capture to cure the problem of infrastructure deficit. And so this is what I want to mention is that during the study, we find it's very difficult to find Chinese infrastructure investment data in Africa. So we have used data of Chinese construction companies, which is basically the revenue that was accrued by the Chinese construction companies. And also it's used as a broad measure for Chinese infrastructure in the past. So this data is collected from China Africa Research Institute from Johns Hopkins University, with a pair close to the variable that we use at hand. So why the data from Chinese construction companies? is that China infrastructure activities in Africa is largely concentrated in the domain of hard infrastructure. So using the revenue construction Chinese company data in Africa is an indicator that we capture also a soft part of infrastructure. And also majority of China infrastructure activities in Africa are not conducted in form of foreign direct investment, and therefore it cannot be easily captured by the investment data provided by China. So looking at this chart, we can clearly see that China engagement in Africa from 2004 up to 2016 is basically on trade. Trade account for majority of this engagement, and followed by construction revenue activities as well as investment, which is more or less, if you can see clearly from this. So the point that I want to highlight from here is that China engagement in Africa is primarily composed of contracting services as opposed to investment. And if on the regional distribution of construction activities from 1998 to 2016, West Africa account for a large part. This is because of resource, and also southern part of Africa is Angola model, which is also account for a large portion of the southern Africa part, and also for Eastern African part, I think SDR we found is also one of the important indicator that is shown in there. So this is the data that and definition and the sources that we used for our study in the quantitative part and in the empirical analysis. So basically here, our variable of interest was industrialization. We wanted to see how does the revenue of Chinese construction activities affect industrialization in Africa, and as measured by manufacturing value addition as percentage of GDP. And for the case of regional integration, we also want to see how does Chinese construction activities has impacted the intra-Africa trade as percentage of country total trade. So basically these two were the variable for our interest in this study. And as I'm not going to go into detail, was used as a control variable in the variable. This is a model that we used for industrialization to measure how does Chinese construction activities affect industrialization in Africa. And for the regional integration also, we use the second equation. So I'm not going to go into details. And finally, what we observed that is totally opposite from our theoretical hypothesis and the body of literature that we have reviewed, that it turns out that Chinese construction contracts has negative correlated with the industrialization as well as for regional integration in Africa. So basically, we can interpret this fact as follows. The result depicts a statistically significant negative relationship between China construction revenue in Africa at the level of industrialization, especially in the $1 million increase in Chinese construction contracts in particular countries associated with reduction of manufacturing value addition by 0.02% on the average after controlling the size, energy, and trade openness. So this is what we basically found from from numbers, from statistics. So basically this only answers the question of what the causation, but we cannot really say that what is happening on the ground. And this turns out to a second part of our study.
Yeah, so once Gomera had run the numbers and he said that there is a clear negative correlation between Chinese construction to African industrialization or African regional integration, we set out with this sort of in the background. So this is a quick chart of the stakeholders we interviewed. So as you can see, most of the stakeholders we've interviewed are from African government departments or officials or companies, because we very clearly wanted to listen to the African perspective. We also interviewed over 10 Chinese companies. Tom made it possible. We visited them in their work sites, in their headquarters. We also spoke to a few Indian actors who were active in the infrastructure sector, like members from Shabuji Buluji, Lasan and Shubro in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And we also spoke to a few African academics, scholars, consultants, ports. Okay, so like I mentioned, we then picked out a few case studies. So in the report, we provide the macro perspectives, right? And then we slowly build and make our way to the case studies. So the Dar es Salaam port we thought was very interesting because Dar es Salaam this port handles over 90% of the country's trade. It also is a major, nodal point for other landlocked countries in the area like Zambia, Rwanda, Uganda. However, the port is also really old, so it suffers from certain operational inefficiencies. So the World Bank came out with this report, and then along with that, the National Port Master Plan was brought out in Tanzania in 2009. And both of these reports, what they have in common is that they both recommend that the Dar es Salaam port needs to be refurbished. So then there was an international tendering, and the contract was won by China Harbour Engineering Corporation. There were, according to contractors at the China Harbour Engineering Company, there were 3 Chinese companies, there was 1 Greek company, there was a South African company, there was a company from Portugal, a company from a Dutch company, and they beat all of them to get the contract. It's a design and build contract which is supposed to cost $154 million. The idea is to build and refurbish the existing port. So they're going to be building 7 new berths. 1 to 4 berths are normal berths and 5 to 7 are container berths. The reason why this was interesting to us was here is a Chinese contractor who has been very, who until at that point had worked on China EXIM funding, but was now working on World Bank funding. So a lot of our conversation very quickly changed to, how does that matter? How is it different? And we got very interesting insights. For one, they said, if you work on World Bank projects, there's a lot of cost overheads that would definitely not be there if it was China EXIM funded. So, we prodded a little further and we said, costs like what? And they said, we have to build these rooms for changing rooms, we have to give training to the local employees, we have to pay them salaries on time, we have to treat them very well, we have to, give them HIV education, and there were all of these things that we don't otherwise have to do. And then they also talked about Chinese standards. They said when it's China EXIM funded, we just, we go build according to Chinese standards, but now they say that you have to build according to British or US standards. So then we can talk about this later in the Q&A, but this was a very interesting exchange that we had. The next we thought was Bagamoyo Port. So Bagamoyo Port, like most of you know, is still very much an idea. But this we picked as a case study because, like you can see, a lot of these infrastructures are at different stages of being built. Bagamoyo is still under negotiation. So the officials that we spoke to, what they told us is the agreement as of now is that the government of Tanzania and China Merchants and Holdings and the Omani State Government Reserve Fund are the principal equity holders, with the China Merchants holding 80%. Of ownership. The negotiations are on, but what was interesting was we were, some of the major insights that we got were about how difficult it was to negotiate a deal with the Chinese. So some of the points that came across was lack of transparency. For instance, how they were in the negotiation room and then terms would keep changing, or that there was a lack of understanding, and then there was also lack of trying to come to a consensus was much more difficult. The next after that was Zanzibar Airport, which again we thought was a very interesting case study. So Zanzibar relies extensively on its tourism revenue. So they wanted to build a terminal, an airport, and the contract was won by Beijing Construction Engineering Group. They are doing the procurement and the building of the airport, whereas the design was done by Beijing Architectural and Engineering Design Company. What was interesting was initially the project was estimated to cost $70.4 million. But after spending $35 million, they came to realize that they had made a very expensive mistake, which was that the runway, the taxiway, was too close to the aero bridge, which meant that Code E aircrafts couldn't land on the taxiway. So as a result of this, what they did was they fired the Turkish consultant who was on the project and they hired a French consultant. So again, we spoke to the operators, we spoke to the consultant, we spoke to the Zanzibar government to try and figure out where was the mistake, how did this lack of coordination happen. And of course, what ensued was a lot of, no real answers. But what was interesting here was that they were renegotiating the terms with EXIM. So obviously EXIM had cancelled because this was a huge mistake, and they had cancelled the funding, the next dash of funding. So as they were renegotiating the deal, the contractor, that is Beijing Construction Engineering Group, they were putting in the money, so the work kept going on. So although the EXIM funds had stopped, the work kept going on, everybody was being paid. So when we asked the contractors, why are you putting in the money? They said, oh, it's only a matter of time, China EXIM funds will come. So there seemed to be this understanding between the contractor, the designer and the operator. And the next, Standard Gauge Railway, as you can see from the list, is the only case study that we've picked from Kenya. However, there were other smaller builders that we spoke to in Kenya, like China Bui, China Jianxi, who are building real estate projects, who are building roads, who are building bridges. Interviews with them have formed part of the larger takeaways we talk about later. But SGR is the flagship project of VRI in Africa. And Tom will tell us more about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Veda. So ICR is a project have been talked a lot in these 2 years. It's a flagship VRI project in Kenya, constructed by China Road and Bridge Company. ICR project is a part of the East Africa Master Plan, and it's trying to connect Mombasa, which is the harbor of the Kenya, and to the Kampala, the capital of the Uganda. And eventually, they aim to connect with the capital of the Rwanda, Kigali. So the SGR Phase 1, which connects Mombasa to Nairobi, which is capital of the Kenya, is a Phase 1. Which cost $3.8 billion and 90% financed by China ICS Bank, and it spent 32 months to complete this project, and it began operation since 31st of May 2017. So we choose SGR is not only it is the biggest infrastructure project since Kenya independence. It's also because these projects have drawn a lot of attention on the high cost, China debts, conflict between Chinese companies and the local laborers. We found a lot of interesting points in these projects. For example, there is a misunderstanding that Chinese companies do not use the local material. We have informed with the different stakeholders, including the Kenya government and also the Chinese companies. 40% construction raw material is from local. And also, we have a deep look on the different issues you will see from our report. I want to explain more.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom, for a brief introduction of the SGR project in Kenya. And as far to Mtwara gas pipeline, this is basically one of the parts of the Tanzania long-term national perspective, whereby by 2025 the country wants to become a low middle income country. So, and this is in line to how we develop in terms of improving infrastructure in the energy sector. So traditionally, Tanzania depends on the hydroelectric power. So recently, we have discovered a number of natural gas sites. So one of which is in Mtwara. So China Pipelines, as one of the subsidiary of Chinese company, so it was contracted to build the pipelines from Mtwara to Dar es Salaam, and the idea was to transform from the hydroelectric power at least to have 50% of natural gas energy in Tanzania. So this is basically one of the interesting cases that we found, that in many parts of Africa, that the issues regarding to energy and natural resources, there's a lot of disagreement on how to manage it and distribute. And we've seen a lot of resource scarce issues, whereby discovery of natural resources has led to countries to enter into conflict and as a negative impact. So what is a very interesting part of this project is that during the operation of the project, there were kind of criticism from the local population that the benefit of the project would not accrue to their locality. So this criticism has led to a creative way of dealing with the descent. And so we come up with the theme that in this project, the government and as well as the contractor, they sit together to find a way on how to deal with the criticism from the local population. So what they did is that they sent some of the local leaders to other countries to learn how the implementation of natural gas projects was done, and after coming back, they use this local leader to disseminate information to other people in the local area. So this is how they managed to deal with this conflict. So this is we found one of the interesting cases in our project. So and again for the national ICT broadband, as we know that the issue of digital divides across developed and developing countries, including Africa, is widely populated. Like people like Samir Amin in 1990s, they proposed that Africa would be left behind because of the lack of ICT development. So what we have seen is that in this project, through China Telecom and Exim Bank, they managed to build fiber optic cable across Tanzania, and also to connect some neighboring landlocked countries in Rwanda, Burundi, and Malawi in the western part of Tanzania. So we find this is a very interesting case as one of the projects where it will accrue some profit from its operation. And also we've seen a lot of improvement as far as it cut down the cost of operations, the cost of internet and some other related activities from utility like e-health, e-educations and others. So, and the issue now is how this project will deal with other related matters, as Veda will explain much as we discovered from the fieldwork.
Yeah, this project was especially important. I think all of these projects are very interesting, but this one was very interesting because the operator, which was the Tanzanian government officials, and then the contractor, which was China Telecom, they seemed to not agree on certain fundamental things. For instance, they had created, so there was this huge fiber optic cable that ran across villages and cities, and then they built these data centers, these internet data centers. And then the Tanzanian government officials were very sure that they had the capacity and the skills to run these data centers, whereas the contractor had very little confidence in that ability. So, for instance, when we talked about technology transfer, this was one thing that sort of didn't seem to fit right. So they said yes, technology transfer, knowledge transfer was a very critical part of negotiating the contract. That was there in paper. But then when we spoke to the China Telecom folks, what they told us is, listen, we are not going to give people a 4-year engineering degree. So if they show us somebody who can handle equipment, we will teach them to run one particular equipment, but we're not going to train them through and through. So there seemed to be an understanding, but like differences in the specificities.
So for these projects, we have interviewed over 10 Chinese companies. We feel some common features here. So first, most of the Chinese, they own the enterprise. They come to Africa because it's government policy driven. The BRI, to push them, you have to go to the Africa and fund the projects. And they enter this market as subcontractors. But later they realize there is a market opportunities here. They start to invest in this country. For example, like PTC projects in Kenya, as which IVIC spend their own money to invest those commercial buildings, a hotel, and also it's three building and one hotel. And also Chinese company cooperate with the local companies, local investment companies to develop this Two River Mall. It's also Chinese companies spend their own money to build these commercial buildings. So we see this trend. They come to Africa for because it's fast, but then they start to be part of the local economy growing. And the second point, we realized for Chinese company, they are not chasing the short-term profit as we thought. As a private enterprise, you should to think about if they can get profit from these projects. But since they are state-owned enterprise, they are not rushed to make money. They prefer to see the long-term benefit. One of our interviewees shared with us, like, even we don't make money for these projects, but I can get the second project, I can get the third project, I can make money by another project. So that's one perspective make them different from the other players in the market. And also because we know the state-owned Chinese company, they are very big, and they ship their equipment from China to Africa, and they prefer to fully use it as different like projects. So if we get more projects in this country, that I can actually use those equipment, and which kind of decrease their cost. The third point, we found the common features of Chinese company. So they are just very prefer to chasing the government projects. So sometimes they will overlook the local content. The next, we want to talk about like how Chinese companies win contracts in African market. When we did the research, I think everyone thinks the Chinese companies are very competitive. So the first competitive thing is the pricing. So I think we got to like everyone agreeing that, even the Africa officers and also different players in the market, also Chinese company, we agree the Chinese construction company is very competitive, and because most of the raw material from China, and which is quite competitive, and also we have this kind of experience on the construction field. The labor compared to the Westerns, the labor cost is quite competitive, which make the whole package of the bidding price very competitive in the market. The second, the Chinese government support in accessing fundings. We have the Chinese ICS Bank, which is also a policy-driven institution, which provide the funding in a very competitive interest. And this part is the Africa government quite prefer. And third thing, because the decision making is not for company themselves, it's from the higher level of the government. Like CCCC come to Africa is not because the leader of the CCCC made the decision, because the Chinese government tell you you should go to the Africa, you should take this one. And the first one, the lower local competition. So compared to the Western players, Chinese prices are very competitive. But for the local construction players, they cannot compete with very efficient and very experienced Chinese construction company too. And the fifth point, so in the past 40 years, China have been experienced a huge infrastructure construction. So which kind of we have a lot of skilled laborers, we have a lot of very big construction companies. They are able to take those projects. And also Chinese companies benefit from the comprehensive industry chain. For example, if you want to start a construction projects from the design, raw material, and construction, also operation, you all can find Chinese players. We don't have to subcontract to the foreigner players or local players. That's the whole point. We get why Chinese company can win a lot of contract in Africa market. And the last thing we want to talk about the Chinese companies' challenge, their challenge in the operating in Africa. So first thing, negative portrayed by media. For SGR projects, last year, the Chinese company have faced a lot of the criticism from media. about the mistreating local laborers, about the high cost. So the Kenya SGR spent more money than the Ethiopia railway. So from Chinese culture, we prefer to solve the conflict indoor rather than discuss in public. So in Chinese company, when some criticisms come in, they prefer not talking to everyone rather than like a facial announcement. So which make them look very bad from the media. And the second thing is having discussed a lot about culture difference and the language barriers. Even the Africa officers, they think the Chinese, they are not good at communication, and they limited English make the conversation not very good. And also the Chinese culture difference make people eat at the different table because we prefer different food. Also make local feel like they are being mistreated. So from these photos, we can see most of the Chinese construction site. You will see this kind of the Chinese slogan. Actually, that means we have to work efficiently or work safely. But they are Chinese. They don't have English explanation and they don't have Swahili. It's just pure Chinese. If you are not in Kenya, you probably feel like we're in China. So which make local feel like you're doing the construction thing in my country, and you make this very China thing, which make local feel very uncomfortable.
Just a line about the cultural differences and language barrier. In the Zanzibar airport project that I talked about earlier, it was really interesting because there was the Zanzibar government representative, the consultant was French, and the designers and the builders and the projects, all of them were Chinese. So they were saying how they had to come up with their own personal dictionary because one couldn't understand what the other was saying. So even when it came to like technical little nuts and bolts and things, they came up, so they showed us a heavy fat document of a dictionary they'd come up with over time so that everyone's on the same page. So these are some of the reflections we had, and we've just generally divided them into three. For the African agency, a lot of people in Nairobi, in Dar, a lot of officials told us that there was a difficulty in comprehension of contract. And this came down to not only negotiating tough deals with the Chinese, but it came down to the specificities that were listed in the contract. In Nairobi, we were also told that they did not have the capacity to negotiate these deals with the Chinese, and therefore they had brought in lawyers from Singapore to negotiate on their behalf. Both of these countries also had very strong local content policies, which said that you had to employ X amount of people, that you had to provide jobs for local people. And it's true, a lot of these Chinese infrastructure projects do generate employment. But what we found was that a lot of these jobs that are generated are at the lower skill levels, not high level or mid-level management. So for instance, when we spoke to operators, engineers in the Tanzania Port Authority, they mentioned that it's not because of lack of skills like everybody said there was. They said that there were graduate schools in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, that had engineers come out every year, but they did not have the opportunity to climb up the management levels. But when we spoke to the Chinese operators, they said, listen, in the contract we said we'll find X amount of jobs, those jobs we've given. And also this question of collective strength, it was brought out again that maybe Kenya or Tanzania, these big African economies, had the strength to negotiate deals with the Chinese. But maybe another country which had less resources, like Malawi for instance, wouldn't have this negotiation power with the Chinese. So there was a lot of talk also about the role the African Union could play, and also the collective strength in negotiating with Africa, with China, not just bilaterally but multilaterally. For Chinese actors, again, localization of labor. It was a lot of Chinese companies did have local labor, but there was also a reluctance in giving jobs to local people. Things like work ethic was questioned, and there was a clear preference for bringing in Chinese workers, but then they had to because they were forced to by the local governments. Like Tom mentioned, there was also a need to improve international management. Again, this was brought out to us that they often did not understand local culture or language, that the SOEs were not allowed. So one of the SOEs contractors told us that they had, every time the SGR came in the press for the wrong reasons, they had a lot of pressure from Beijing to send a response and explain themselves. but they couldn't even have a social media account until very recently. So they couldn't even put across their point of view. But one of the things that came across in all the, like the Tanzania Investment Authority, the Kenya Investment Authority, everyone told us about one of the reasons why Chinese companies would be preferred is for their entrepreneurial culture. So one of the examples that was given to us is if it's a World Bank funded project and there's like a French firm or another Western firm that's here, the manager is not going to go stay in a place that's too far off the capital. So they'll have to arrange a helicopter service to something that will take the manager from Nairobi to from Dar to Morogoro or wherever. But in the Chinese projects, the top managers, the mid managers, everybody stayed on site. Everybody stayed in very frugal means, one thing they kept saying is once they take it up, then they finish the job. And sometimes they finish projects well before time. But interestingly, when we asked Chinese actors, who are your biggest competition when it comes to getting contracts, they said other Chinese companies. So their biggest competition was subsidiaries. So when, for instance, CCCC has many subsidiaries and there is competition among these subsidiaries. And there's also a tacit understanding that if one subsidiary has one contract in one country, the others would sort of, not compete. Indian actors, we tried to see on the field if there were some interactions between Indian actors and Chinese actors. It came down to, for instance, they told us that some of the Chinese companies subcontract to Indian companies, but they said that they view Indian companies as local companies. They also said, more than one Chinese company said they prefer using the Tata tipper lorry and so on. But I think the large field can be sort of summarized in a quote that a gentleman in Dar told us, that the only place Indian and Chinese actors meet in Africa is the casino. The Indian contractors we spoke to from Sharpunji, Palunji, Latin and Chubro, they said that the big difference was that they enjoyed less government support in comparison to the Chinese. And they also mentioned, when we asked about the contract management, a lot of African officials mentioned that this could possibly be an area where India-Africa cooperation could extend. So the conclusions?
Yeah, finally we came up with the following conclusion, to say from the quantitative analysis we found that negative correlation between Chinese construction activities and African industrialization and regional, African industrialization as well as regional integration. So the possible reason could be the intra-Africa regional trade is too low, and also most of the raw materials, as we have seen from different project cases, that most of the materials were procured from abroad and not locally procured. So this is a less direct link between the local industries and Chinese infrastructure engagement in Africa. So this is what we have.
Also, if I could just interject at this point. So we figured if Kenya and Tanzania were winning all these billion-dollar contracts and all these Chinese companies, and the construction is everywhere for anybody who visits to see the Chinese banners everywhere, then we figured then it should be that the local industry has grown substantially. So we just sort of dug one level down and we met with local cement suppliers, local steel suppliers, and some of them are actually closing down shop. So there hasn't been a tangential increase in local suppliers. So that sort of correlated with his statistical regressions.
Yeah, this is basically what is relying, what is a possible explanation that why we found the negative correlation, because nature of Chinese activities engagement in Africa is kind of construction services. It's not kind of investment as opposed to investment as I mentioned earlier. So, there's no direct link between local manufacturing and the infrastructure project. So this is basically we come out from the fieldwork.
Also, the question of African agency, I think we should mention it here. Every single contractor we spoke to said, listen, we don't set quality. We build infrastructure in Europe, we build infrastructure in Africa. So quality is set by the African governments. So there was a clear, and there were cases where, for instance, in Nairobi it was pointed out that for SGR construction, all of the raw materials were being imported. And they were not buying anything locally. At that point, the government of Kenya had stepped in. They told us that they brought the stakeholders and the local suppliers on the same table, and they facilitated this conversation where the argument was that the local products that came out locally did not meet their standards. So they were sort of told how they could raise their standards, and then there was a conversation, and then they proceeded to consume things locally. So then the role of the African agency, I think we need to stress at the conclusion, it came across on all interviews that they set the standards, they set the quality, and they have an incredibly important role in signing good deals with China. To conclude, we'll just show you some pictures from the field. That's the Zanzibar Airport Terminal site on top, and the Salaam Port project. The Nairobi terminal at night, and this is the SGR terminal. On the one side is the passenger trains, and the other side is the cargo. These are some of the interviews we conducted. Thank you.
Thanks to all three of you for this excellent presentation. There's a lot of food for thought and comment. I think we have 50 minutes. We're not going to take a coffee break, right? So if you permit, I'm going to allow this till 12 o'clock because we've already had the coffee break. Is that okay? No? Yeah, all right. I'm going to make several comments at this stage itself, and they're going to be in no clear order because you've covered so much ground. But let me reiterate what I said in my opening remarks. A lot of the lessons learned, which are reflected in your report, have already been taken on board, at least in principle, in theory, in FOCAC 2018. If you look at the FOCAC documents, a lot of the negativity has been addressed. Now, whether it happens in actual implementation, only time will tell over the next 3-year period. Because you're going to cover 2019 to 2021 in the next 3-year period. So let's be clear. It's not that the lessons or the negatives have not been addressed, have not been understood by the Chinese authorities. Now, whether in actual implementation Chinese companies do that or not, we will see. That will be only time will tell. The second point I think you need to bear in mind is that whether it's China or India or Turkey or Brazil or Russia, this is additional projects. These are countries that are doing projects over and above which the old colonial rulers have done or have not done in the last 70, 80 years and should have done. Now you can justifiably argue that they were colonials. Some of the new investments or projects are also colonially oriented or raw material oriented, but that's a different issue. The fact is, all the new partners of Africa are bringing additional projects, additional investment into Africa. So Africa today, African countries, whether it is Tanzania or, I've been Deputy High Commissioner in Tanzania, I can tell you. Today, the old main partners were seasoned, for instance. We didn't build infrastructure in Tanzania. Why not? They basically had Ujama socialism. Now, question is, when you talk of infrastructure, please bear in mind that infrastructure does not only address intra-regional connectivity. You are actually opening up the country. A railway from Dar es Salaam to Matwara or to any other part of Tanzania to Arusha is opening up the country, it's integrating the country, it's developing local markets. It's breaking down domestic barriers, whether it's a road or a railway or an airport. Now, you will not see this reflected in statistical regression analysis. It will not happen. That is the whole problem with infrastructure. That's why no private sector companies do infrastructure unless they are related to a particular mine output or something like that. Or you're actually exploiting some raw materials or excavating power or something. So please bear in mind that a pure and simple economic analysis will not do. Infrastructure is expensive. The advantage with infrastructure is that it is not only Chinese investments which will follow. Anybody who wants to invest will invest once there is a railway or a road being built from point A to B. It opens up the market. The intra-regional or inter-regional connectivity is an additional point. You're connecting Uganda, you're connecting Rwanda, you're connecting Burundi, fine. You're connecting Malawi, but you are serving more than one purpose. So you'll have to, in any assessment of advantage or cost, benefit or return, you have to look at the longer term horizon. You cannot just look at the short term. So your current conclusions are fine, there's no problem with that. But you can't, it is not the only conclusion. Right? So that must be addressed in your report. And the fact is all the new parts of Africa are providing a clear alternative. And that is why the others are so worried. Why is DAC so keen that you come and adopt our standards? They don't understand that we are not talking about aid. We're talking about development cooperation. Yes, these are loans. They are not grants, most of them are loans. But if the African countries have grown debt from the West, they can also grow debt from the East. I mean, China has written out a lot of debt in forecast policy, and so have we. So these are problems which I think partner countries will have to address with Beijing. So we will see what the responses are. So I think there is criticism should be positive. It should not be as if this is all negative. Because even if you are building up debt, you are still building infrastructure and you are building capacities. Your criticism about training, etc., is very valid. This is where I think there has been a problem in drawing up projects. And I think the biggest problem is which is not reflected, frankly, as whether it should be in the new FOCAT documents. The Chinese do not really make a difference between project and investment. Like most of the projects which China has done in India are projects, or they are mergers and acquisitions, they are not investments. So, I think this distinction has been made very clearly. There is a higher grant element, for instance, in the new documents which we have to see. FDI is not the route for infrastructure development. Has not been in any country. It wasn't in China either. A lot of the initial investment in China in infrastructure came from loans, grants from Japan, from China, from the World Bank, etc. Loans, low-cost loans. So, FDI does not develop infrastructure except in a very limited sense. You have to understand that is the reality of the economics. I mean, there's no other way of looking at it. Norm setting, you're absolutely right, but norm setting is also dependent on governments. And you cannot have African Union norm setting. Africa is not one country. Africa has 54 countries. I think we don't understand. Tanzania is different from Kenya. Forget everything else. And very different from Mozambique, for instance. Even more different from Rwanda, Burundi, etc. The politics is different, the economy is different, the history is different. Just because it is Africa and they speak maybe Swahili does not make it one country or one continent. So you have to take that into account. And that is why African Union projects do not work. I'm sorry, I'm being very candid here, but they don't work. Most of the projects we are trying to do at the African level don't work because they can't agree on things. So, this is something we must bear in mind. I'm not very convinced by your argument that SOEs don't seek profit.
They do.
No, that's why I don't agree with you. I think the SOE cost structure, like the old public sector in India, is a very high cost structure. So they cannot seek short-term benefit beyond the point because the loading costs are very high. You talked about a CEO of a project living in Dar es Salaam and not on the site. But to build infrastructure for all the staff and labor to live on the site is very expensive. That has to go to the cost. Private sector does not do that. The SOEs have to do it because they do the same thing in China for their people. So I think you cannot come to that judgment so quickly that they are looking only at long-term profit and not short-term profit. That's not the case. What is true is what you have said. Otherwise, all three of you, they are very confident that we are going to get it back.
Yeah. Like of all the case studies.
Yeah, but they don't cost it. You see.
Yeah.
You see, I don't have money from Exim Bank, but I am putting in my own money. It costs me. They do not put the cost as money in the project. Money costs, it doesn't matter who's paying something. So when you go to bank, the bank will charge you about 5 to 10, 11% depending on the country you're in. But you're not costing it. And that is one of the biggest reasons why Chinese companies are competitive. They don't put cost of finance into the equation at all. By and large. I think please address this question because the cost of money is extremely important. In China, a project cost of land, cost of water, cost is also important. But outside, the critical thing is cost of money. And that can be very expensive. I don't want to say much more on this, but you talked about entrepreneurial culture. I don't think that is quite accurate.
If they don't have it?
No. I think the culture is similar, depends on the circumstances and the project. But simply because CEO stays on site and does not share is not a reflection of entrepreneurial culture. The difference is you are delivering on time. That is what partner countries want. Now, you can deliver on time without being too particularly entrepreneurial. If you're bringing everything from China, and there are no local restrictions, there are no requirements of local content or whatever, it is much easier to deliver. It's actually cheaper to deliver also. You don't have to train anybody. So these are just some broad points I wanted to make for your consideration before I open this out. And my final thing, I think you could address one additional point in your report if you have the data. Where is Chinese investment going in these two projects? Sector-wise. Investment in these particular projects is fine. They're creating infrastructure. But what is the other Chinese investment that's going in? Is it related to this infrastructure investment or is it independent of it? Then you get a slightly bigger picture, which will be, because your report should not be seen as something which is intended to simply criticize. I don't think you have brought out enough positives of what is happening.
If I may just sort of add this one. So, like a lot of the points that you brought out, the question of loan, debt, of infrastructure itself, of inter-regional, all of this we sort of addressed in our report because it's a 150-page report. So sort of summarizing that for today was a challenge because we were even deciding what to say when. So a lot of the context and background we've left out today, which is there in the report. Also this question of Chinese investments into these countries. So like I said, initially we provide macro perspectives and then we build our way down. So this we thought we'll just talk about here because these were the little things that we got from the field, which we thought maybe an audience like this wouldn't otherwise get to hear.
No, I think in your conclusions there should be a balance between negatives and positives because your conclusions basically are leading towards the negative. But I think there are a lot of positives from these kind of investments also. In fact, you can highlight the negatives even more. For instance, in the last 5 years, 10 years, 5 years, Kenya's debt to China has gone up by several fold. So no, that's okay, but it's also brought, you have to answer the question also, why is the Kenyan government taking this money? Would it have gotten cheaper from any other source? So I think you need to bring in, I only read what you sent me, which is basically what you did here. But for me, it gives the impression that there is a tendency to lean towards the negative in your conclusions, which may well be the case, but I think you need to present it very clearly in your summary also, so that people don't think you're doing a report simply because you want to be very negative. But I must say, I think people in Beijing should read this report as carefully as anybody else, including Delhi, because this has lessons for all of us. This has lessons for all South partners in Africa. So you don't repeat each other's mistakes, and maybe we can collaborate more. That's the last point I want to make. And I think we can do much more together in Africa. So I leave it at that. I think I said more than I should have said. But I'll now throw over the floor. Please introduce yourself and address yourself to the authors of the report. The floor is open. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Ravi Bhusalingam from Institute of Chinese Studies.
Maybe they don't know you. That's why you.
First of all, let me congratulate Veda, you and the entire team. I think this is a really pioneering work. Not only for the detailed groundwork that you have done, but for the model which you have developed to kind of develop the whole project. So the few things I'm going to say, I'm not going to expound on the great value of the report, which I've said in these few sentences. I'm going to pick on a few things with the intention of trying to improve. First thing is, I think Ambassador Suri said there is a disjunction between the theoretical and mathematical conclusion and the narrative that the entire report conveys. And when there is that sort of disjunction, I think it needs to be x-rayed further as to why is that happening. Now, the benefits of infrastructure are, when it happens, really the benefits are not apparent. The benefits flow over a period of time. and so there is to be a time series analysis. Secondly, the benefits are primary, secondary and tertiary. There is a benefit, for example, which is fairly quick in terms of the valuation of land and property, which is right next to the infrastructure, be it the road or railway or whatever. That happens fast. But in terms of job creation, education, all the other benefits, it takes time. I think your Professor Barbara Morton, right, in her work, has said this can play out over 10 or 12 years in terms of community development. So I think there is, I don't know technically how you will do it, whether you take present value or how you will do it, to truly evaluate the value of infrastructure. But I think the measure you're using, for the sake of brevity, it's easy, it's brief, but to my mind it is misleading. So you may have to address that. Otherwise, your conclusions come in two parts. One is saying white and the other is saying black, and you kind of then struggle. So that's one thing. Second thing, I think you brought out the complexities of the projects on the cultural dimension, working together, etc. very, very simply and strongly. I think one or two examples would work here in trying to lay out what would be the alternative cost. For example, people criticize the Chinese company, saying all the components come from China, all the labor comes from China, all the subcontractors are Chinese. But as a result of that, I think Thong mentioned this, that there is greater competitiveness. They all know each other, they work together, they form part of a value chain in China and in other projects. Therefore, their delivery is at lower cost and their time taken is lower. Now, if you were to throw open tendering to world tenders, and if you were to do all that, you would get an alternative B, which would be more diverse. But I would think the cost would be much more and the time would be much more. So, if one or two alternative scenarios can be developed, then people can say, okay, I may not like this uniform way of doing it, but it is delivering on time and cost. If I do the alternative, it's going to cost me so much more, so what do I feel about that? So that's my second point. Third is, infrastructure in general is a difficult area worldwide because you're dealing with a lot of complexity, acquisition of land, displacement of people, and so on and so forth. And so these problems in infrastructure are not unique to Chinese companies in Africa. They're everywhere. I think the key point is, again, what Ambassador Suri said, what is the learning curve? Is the learning curve of Chinese companies as good, poorer, or better than other infrastructure companies operating elsewhere? And fourthly, my last point is, again, a question of an alternative scenario. Chinese are giving this kind of financing package largely by loans and by products in kind and swap payments against natural resources and so on. What are the alternatives left for African governments? If they say, okay, this system has got these problems, what are the alternatives? Is anyone else coming to the table and saying something which is somewhat competitive? And if they are not, then what do they do? Do they drop the infrastructure development goal or what do they do? I think that aspect, somewhere in your report, I'm sure you must have mentioned it, needs consideration, because it is, any decision has to be seen against what are the possible alternatives. I'll stop there and end by once again congratulating you and saying that I think your report will make a very, very important mark, and it should be read not only in Delhi, in Beijing, but all through Africa and elsewhere as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravishesh. We'll take 3 or 4 questions and you will start. Or do you want to take them all together? 3 or 4 together? Okay, Shesh.
Again, let me congratulate also the young team who've done very good and very investigative work. Just 2 points very briefly. Dwelling further on what both Mr. Bhuthalingam and Ambassador Naren mentioned, the same point about the regression. Because infrastructure is a public good and it can have a variety of uses, and it depends on how you make use of it. But since you have come out with this negative finding, some of the aspects come over a period of time. I'm not sure if you will be able to analyze them fully. But one aspect, if you could focus on, which might be useful, because a port, for example, can facilitate export, but it can facilitate import also. So, has it facilitated more imports? And if you mentioned about cement products, certain factories closing down. Have these improvements in infrastructure facilitated more imports to the detriment of even existing local industry? That is an aspect, I think, which you might perhaps like to investigate a little further. In which case, the priorities chosen for infrastructure development probably should have been somewhat different, which promotes industrialization first before you start importing. Of course, imports are also necessary for industrialization, but you will have to sequence them in a manner that there is balance. So that's an aspect that you can look at. The second area is more in terms of suggestions. You have done the 6 case studies. Again, in the same light, if they have not contributed to industrialization in the way, would you suggest what are the ways by which they can think of new industries or projects by which they can piggyback on the infrastructure development put in place already? So that would be a very useful suggestion in terms of further industrialization and for companies to take on making use of existing infrastructure. I thought these 2 aspects will give it a little more substance to the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, sir, please.
Mahendra Ram, I teach in JNU. Very interesting reports. We are doing similar kind of studies in trying to compare South Asia and Southeast Asia and Central Asia. Very interesting findings, and I have 1 or 2 comments to make. First is, the correlation and the finding that there is a negative correlation, that too between the what you call the construction revenue and industrialization and regional integration. This is a little far-fetched, I would say, precisely because you have several variables in between, indicators of industrialization, indicators of market integration, or regional integration. So several variables. 1. Secondly, there will be a very what you call it, strong influence of the lags, right? You need to have adequate lags in between. Then you will also have presence of large number of proxy variables. In what way you can really demonstrate this. So at this stage, I think an econometric analysis could be a little immature, but I would feel much more rational and logical would be pre and post analysis. What was the situation before all these infrastructures were created? The GDP, the outputs at a very, very grassroots level, in different facets of output. And what is the post situations after 2 years, how they have started growing. One segment could be natural growth. The other segment could be triggered by this kind of interventions. So I think that would be much more, maybe you can do such kind of econometric analysis maybe after 12 years, 10 years, 15 years with a significant time lag and when you have a good set of time series data. My second plea to all of you, in order to enrich your research findings, I think it will be very important, very interesting for the policymakers, both in Africa and west of the global community, to compare the major parameters or variables among these projects. Since you have done these 6 projects, intensive analysis of these 6 projects, could you give us a kind of a broad picture of what are the similarities and what are the striking dissimilarities, because it's done by the Chinese alone, right? And basically on infrastructure related projects. So if you are able to give us a broad picture of how a Chinese company has approached in a kind of more or less a similar geography, right? More or less similar sector in 10 different issues. Say for example, on raw materials, how they are managed. Second on labor. Third on land acquisitions, displacement issues. Then the services like banking, insurance. Then the fourth would be loan conditionalities, including repayment, default. What are the default conditions, right? And the fifth would be on the project maintenance part of it, who is going to maintain it. Then what you call the skill formation part, and after that, then technology transfer, and the last would be the output management. How they, if you are able to give us this, then you see how the same country and the same approach and same geography have differed in approach, and that would bring us very interesting results for us to see in what Chinese are doing in Pakistan, right? So for example, it's quite interesting to see that we were studying the water and the common program in 2 different geographies, right? In 2 different countries, right? And who were the companies involved in this? What were the conditions? Who did the feasibility report? What were the parameters incorporated in feasibility reports, techno-economic service, and how these feasibility reports, the various parameters were actually integrated with the finances. It's a very intriguing situation. So my last point would be, one of the things which very clearly came out in both the presentation by Ambassador Suri and Ambassador Kant is when they said that we should go out of the stereotypes, right? All kinds of. There is a class of discourse, right, which is very remarkably seen in today's literature. There is a discourse which you said that the World Bank, the ADB, or any other international institutions will have their managers sitting in air-conditioned room, far off, enjoying all the facilities, right? And in contrast, you will find the Chinese managers will be mingling with local people, eating local food, whatever it is, right? Or some kind of things like being in the factory or around factory, right? Now, there is some kind of a class of discourse. That is, there is an established discourse that this is the way how to manage a project, right? And the other side of the story is there is some kind of a new model of managing a project, doing a project, right? So the people who designed this discourse at the global level would not like this discourse to really come up. Right? We have seen that very, very clearly. The norms, international environmental norms or technological norms or all kinds of, labor norms and all. So, please, if this report would be of tremendous value, if you say, what is that non-traditional management parameters Chinese are trying to include into it? Because if you read the AIIB literature, right? The objectives is basically, it basically says that it is to bring new financial investment and financial architecture at the global level, away from what IMF does, what ADB does, or what World Bank does, right? It says that very clearly. So there is apparently a class of discourse. Say, for example, loan, as Ambassador Suri was absolutely saying that. The loan element, the debt element was always there. Otherwise, there would not have been a plan like Baker Plan in 1980s. There would not have been several other programs for rescheduling of these debts and all kinds of things, right? But why we are highlighting the debt today? Why not we highlighted the debt situations in Africa for the last 30? If you see the untapped reports and all, you will find this. So that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question in this first round. Question, comment? Ambassador Aminu.
I'd like to start by thanking you all for that really comprehensive report.
To the mic, please.
I believe that there are some gaps that probably didn't come out due to the truncated nature of your presentation. As a government official, it is very difficult for me to speak candidly about some of the issues raised, but I feel that maybe we needed to go in depth a little more about why we have gone the China way as opposed to the traditional ways of having our infrastructure facilitated. The whole element of the debt, I feel that a lot of the time we have the Western narrative which is being pushed to show that it is not the correct way for Africa to go. And for reasons that we are, it might be that they feel dislodged by the Chinese influence in Africa. Then, when you talked about the infrastructure, the Chinese infrastructure having a negative correlation to industrialization, I am inclined to believe that that is not entirely accurate, because I feel like many of these, many of those projects had existed long before the Chinese came. They were not existing because of the Chinese. So we need to be careful about how we word some of those things, because it looks like their very existence depended on the Chinese project, which is inaccurate. And as I said, being a government official, there's only so much I can say, so I will stop right here.
No, thank you. That's very useful. I think you were candid enough. I think our team has understood your message. Veda, would you all respond now?
So when we begin the report, right, we have a whole section about how the benefits, the tricky thing about studying infrastructure, like many of you mentioned, the benefits of this infrastructure, the impact of this infrastructure. We probably should go back in 15 years and do like a follow-up study to the study to assess impact. And therefore it is difficult to calculate. So the negative correlation part, when we write it in the report, we are very cautious when we see it, because again, like you said, the time lapse it's a very small time. And a lot of these, you're right, a lot of these projects have existed. But what we thought was interesting was like what Ambassador Sheshadri said. We thought it was interesting to look at their interaction with infrastructure that pre-existed. For instance, the SGR, for example, right? So when you travel in the SGR, there's already a highway that parallels the SGR, which is an old colonial highway, right? But however, we were told that the government of Kenya has made it compulsory for businesses in Nairobi and Mombasa to use the SGR and not really the highway. So and that is also part of making sure the SGR becomes profitable and it becomes viable. And a lot of the businesses we spoke to said that SGR is actually in theory more efficient than the highway. But the problem, of course, was with the last mile connectivity. The ports, the customs, it would take much more time than the roadways and so on and so forth. So that was an interesting part of the interaction. And I completely agree with you. We have another section on the question of loan and debt, where we argue that this alarmist literature that we went reading, going into the continent, that alarmist literature stopped short very quickly, because there is a certain nonchalance when we speak about the loan and the debt, right? If I may quote one of the interviewees that told us, when we asked him, are you afraid that your government will not be able to pay back the loans, or like, is that a concern? And he said, the British have been mining diamond mines in our country for over a century, and we've not made a penny out of those mines. So if you're asking me, am I scared of China? The answer is no, but I'm scared of the white man. So this anti-West sentiment was, so a lot of scholars we spoke to, a lot of officials we spoke to, there was definitely a nonchalance when it came to the debt narrative, and we were also told repeatedly that it was largely a Western narrative, and we had to be careful when we addressed that. And so the question of broad features, interesting you said that, because our questionnaire was exactly based like this: raw materials, project maintenance, labor, land acquisition. So the only question that we didn't get answers to, honestly, is the loan question. A lot of people shied away from even talking about the contract or the conditions of the loans. That was a no-go. But this was actually very interesting, because what we've done right now is we've answered all these questions project-wise, but we haven't looked at it, zoomed out and looked at it. So I think that would be a very interesting addition to the report.
Thank you. Let me reply on the regression part. I totally agree that correlation always does mean correlation. So that's why in the last part of the conclusion says this could be a possible reasons. So correlation doesn't mean correlation. So in the process of running the model, we actually learned some other tests, like for example, we check for correlation, multicollinearity between the variables, and like we employ the Osman test to see whether a fixed model, random fixed model is appropriate. And so again, we very much grateful for your comments, and we are going to look at it more deeply and see whether we can go back through the process and report back. So, and in the case of, for example, like when we say, when you look at the nature of Chinese infrastructure investment or infrastructure projects, like we have explored to a number of stakeholders, especially government officials, and so what they normally they confess to us that the procurement part, each country in these two countries, Kenya and Tanzania, they all have local content policy, which have certain requirements for any project to procure or to hire local labors. So, but actually, what is happening, the huge chunk, like in terms of percentage, is procured abroad. We are not branding that because most of the material, especially the high tech, like for example, for National Broadband ICT project in Tanzania, were locally not available. So we are not blaming the Chinese for procuring abroad, but we are saying that the African agencies should also be aware of what is happening actually, and then in order to capture the benefits. And also the issue of time was also we are grateful for that. We have to be sensitive to say that the benefit of the infrastructure project can be accrued for overtime. We cannot see it in overnight. So this is we appreciate for that comment, and we are going to look deeply and go back through the process and see whether we have made we can make some corrections in some areas.
So I want to talk about a little bit about Chinese company long-term profit thing. Actually, because the time limited, we don't discuss more during the presentation. Actually, this problem have different angles. So the first, the Chinese construction companies, they prefer stay in Africa for a long time. They prefer to take the first project, second project consistently. And one of the reasons they can do the projects evergreen with with this gentleman about infrastructure projects are very expensive, but also Chinese company can take a very competitive price because the equipment is already here, the people are already here. They don't expend more money for the second, the third projects. That's the first thing. The second thing, we also have to consider the Chinese internal problem because we don't have any more infrastructure projects in China. And the people capital also costs internal China thing. So that's why we have this policy go abroad or VRI. Because if we push those people go abroad, this kind of costs less for our internal thing. So it's also another perspective why the Chinese construction company looking for the opportunity outside. But for China's decision maker, for them it's like even you don't make money outside, you still save money internal. So for them it's still benefit. That's a little bit more about that.
Okay, we'll take the second round of questions and then we'll open up for the roundtable discussion. Dr. Ray.
First of all, congratulations, Veda, for that, your team, for this very good, excellent presentation and your work that you have done. You know, my question will relate to the first aspect that you talked about, regional integration, the negative correlations. When I look at your 6 case studies and the kind of correlations that you have reached about, it has negative impact on the regional integration. I somehow cannot correlate when I look at your case studies because you are doing Bagmaya port, you are doing the Salaam port. You have done a case study of SGR only on the Mombasa and Nairobi connections, but you have not gone beyond that. So how did you come into this correlation? Is just a literature study? Because if you go by Kenyan government's perspective or China's, China's perspective, they all said it is going to support the EU Agenda 2063 CFTA project. All these VRI initiatives will actually help continental integration. So I somehow you need to explain me about how this, because if you talk about SGR, if you don't do a project analysis going beyond Kenya or Zambia, where this whole connectivity of railway is connected. Zambia, for example, Tazara is there for all. But look at where the East Africa community is doing, their master plan. They're trying to put East Africa community in the center, in the CFTA, right in the Cape to the Cairo. So so your project is very, since 6 case studies does not fall into the larger, conclusions that you're reaching. Somewhere I find that gap is there you need to address. Second, in your study, have you tried to look at, about industrialization again? What are the variables that you have taken to come to the conclusion that it has not led to that? For example, let's say about airport in Zanzibar. So how did you come to that conclusion? Because nowhere you need to stress on those facts.
Okay, Kishan, go ahead. You have a question?
No, not really a question, but I just wanted to congratulate the team researchers. I think it's a very, very impressive and a very interesting study. Really gives a great insight into how people are dealing with that continent, how lessons to be learned from there. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's important that every person who's actually looking at Africa as a country to invest in and to sort of get into infrastructure projects to take it as a lesson to be learned kind of a thing. Also share her view. I think some of these projects have been taken in part. We need to do a more holistic kind of study for these projects, which are, of course, the scope of the studies is primarily infrastructure and in 2 countries, so I understand the limits of the study. But perhaps we should be a little more adventurous and go a bit beyond so that we get a much more comprehensive and rounded view of investments by China and lessons to be learned by other countries about going into Africa, and somehow sort of integrating with the local situation and the local, the environment in that place, and see whether there are opportunities for cooperation, for joint ventures by a couple of countries, together, if not alone. probably give us a little more stability in that region, and understanding of that region, and integrate them further into the economy of the world.
Santosh?
First, I want to compliment the team because it's a multicultural team. I really think you have a very good position to do this report. The second thing is you managed to do the toughest thing, which is field work, because I don't think similar interviews will be possible in India with Chinese companies operating here. So those are the good things. And in terms of suggestions, you have received a lot of suggestions, but the practical one is there was a similar statistical study done in 2007 by a person called Buckley, where he, for the first time, studied Chinese overseas investments along similar parameters. The political stability of the host country, what impact it has on that economy, and so on and so forth. So maybe you can use that study as some kind of a framework. And also, to add to other comments, what is when you are giving a non-Western perspective, what you should do is you should see whether overall as a country, whether Kenya and Tanzania have very high debt levels, and in that context, is China forcing more debt? That maybe can be criticized, but what I have heard is Kenya's median age is much lower than India, and there's a lot of potential, and Kenya desperately needs these projects, which have been delayed by several years. So I think that kind of a zoomed out perspective will be more objective. And my last point is on the attitude of Chinese companies towards Africa. I think what will make more sense is how they choose these areas, because Kenya and Tanzania, I think, are countries which represent a lot of potential, just like Nigeria maybe. So maybe you need to look at that at an Africa level and see how China has chosen these projects. And there's also angle of how many of the projects are prestige or trophy projects, like building some government parliament building or something, or if it's a railway. So I think all these infrastructure projects are pretty good. And I think that there was a comment you made on how Africans don't have capacity to deal with bilateral negotiation. I don't know. That's a huge generalization, because what I think, Djibouti, a small country, has American bases, Chinese bases, French bases. I think that requires a very high level of sophistication, to have discussions with countries. So that I kind of disagree with. I don't think China, dealing with China is that much of a challenge for African countries. And the last point, which I think you should probe a little more, is the India linkage. You said the Indian contractors in Kenya or Tanzania are viewed as domestic contractors. I think this is like a win-win situation, because if African countries want to push for domestic content, and if Indian contractors are already there, and today Indian companies are bidding for airport construction in Maldives and Greece and Brazil. So I don't see any reason why Indian companies can't participate in design of infrastructure projects, because I think the design cost is also sensitive, right? Similarly, just like how Chinese cost is lower than Western companies, I think Indian design cost would be lower than French or any other consulting company which does the design cost. So I think that should be probed a little more. Maybe L&T, Sharpur Quality, and GMR. These are the big infrastructure companies which are going out from India. So maybe you can interview them here in India at headquarters and see what is their sort of perspective on these African countries, and of course they will have to get familiar with Chinese standards, which is again a potential for cooperation, because if Indian companies understand Chinese standards, construction standards, and can design projects which are acceptable to the Chinese, I think the African countries will welcome that package, because there's no disconnect, there's no expensive mistakes of constructing these runways in the wrong way. So I think that we can probe, because at the end of the day, this would be seen as an Indian perspective on Chinese involvement in Africa, and it would be good to put some meat on the table for Indian scope for Indian participation. Thank you.
Okay, will the others want to react?
Before I hand it to you, because I know you really wanted to. Okay, so I think it didn't really become clear in the presentation, but the quantitative aspects, like you can imagine, we couldn't get any data on construction, like Chinese construction in Tanzania or Chinese construction in a province in Tanzania or in Kenya. So all of the quantitative stuff, data from the China Africa Research Institute in Johns Hopkins, it's pan-Africa. So all the quantitative regressions is on a continental level. But the problem is we were very clear from the beginning, we didn't want to just write a report on Africa, right? Because again, of course, it's made up of 50 odd countries and it's very, very different regionally. So then the idea was, okay, so we have this pan-African perspective and this is what the numbers tell us on a continental level. Now let's just go to the field, to specific projects. So these projects are in no measure talking to the numbers. These projects are just specific case studies to just see, but how does this work out on the ground? So we asked the Chinese contractors simple questions. How did you get this project? Like how did you, what was the bidding process like? How many laborers did you bring in? What kind of management techniques did you use? So these are two different sort of approaches which we hopefully will try and sort of connect to the report.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add up to what Dr. Veda said, is that we moved from the, like we employed the deductive approach, like from general perspective to inductive, to like a micro level and see what is actually happening. So this is what is the approach for our study. So it's a mixed method. So coming back to the question that you asked, in the sample we use out of 54 African countries, we managed to have data for 40 African countries, and in each model. And for the time series, is the data cover from the year 2003 to the year 2016, and the number of observation was limited to 617. So this is basically how we come up. And for the measure of manufacturing value addition as a measure for industrialization, this is basically come out from different literature, body of literature that we have been reviewing, that a required measure for industrialization for any country, you have to see how this country has structurally transformed from its primary sector to secondary sector and into tertiary sectors. So MVA is one very common method indicator used to measure industrialization. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to answer the question how Chinese choose those projects. Actually, they do have some patterns. It's basically, it depends on the negotiation between Africa countries and the Chinese leaders. So as I know, the SGR phase 2, phase 3 is still pending because they haven't figured out the deals. So now Chinese government is very cautious to the debts because they have been criticized a lot. You have been gave too much loans to Africa country. So it's basically, if they gave the preference loan, it depends on the negotiation between Africa country and the Chinese high leaders. And Chinese leaders will decide if they will send the loan by China is expected. That's the thing I want to say.
Okay, I think we have a question.
Yeah.
We'll make it the last question because we have to shift move on to the roundtable.
Well, I am Suresh Pandey, a journalist. This question is addressed to Dr. Veda Vaidyanathan. You mentioned about the bitter experience of the vendors. That is one aspect. And the quality factor or the standardization when it comes to ports and airports, there is nothing known as Chinese standards. ICAO, an airport has to have all the facilities as per the ICAO norms. Then the seaports, they go by the International Maritime and Admiralty factors. And other than infrastructure, are there any turnkey projects undertaken by the Chinese companies in African nations?
Okay, this response. But that's a comment basically, that you just can't build an airport that are ICAO and IMO standard which are different. I think that point I don't think you suggested that they were going to be different. But I think the point
just quick one. For the Zanzibar Airport project, all of these international standards were part of the deal, and also there were some additional requirements. For example, for the safety part, they applied like UK standards. So some of the Chinese standards and international standards was also part of the deal. But I think the problem was the consultancy, like the leading consultancy. There was no coordination between different stakeholders. That's why there was an expensive mistake.
And just to the suppliers, the local suppliers you asked about, that was actually very coincidental because a couple of people told us that a lot of contractors that we were talking, so Lama sir, this comes back to your question, right? When we talk to a Chinese contractor and we say, where do you source your supplies from? They don't say China. They say we get everything locally. If there's something that we don't get locally, then we bring it from China. So then we contacted Sharpunji Puluji, Larsen and Toubro. When we spoke to them, they sort of gave us the contacts of local cement manufacturers and local steel manufacturers. So then we went to these industrial areas and we visited their offices, which again is very tricky, right? Because most of them thought we were spies and they wouldn't even let us through the door. And they were like, why are these girls asking us about who's buying our cement? So then once we convinced them that we were not spies and we were researchers, then they sort of opened up a little bit. And then they gave us contacts of other suppliers that we could speak to. So we traveled to Mombasa to speak to one of the oldest cement suppliers, right? And all of them across the world, again, I understand there's a risk of generalization here. So when we say, like when we suggest something, it's not to say that all of Africa this is a problem and all of Africa this is a pattern. And this has to be, I think, made very clear in the report, very case sensitive. But one thing that they told us in Kenya, for instance, was that our industries have not grown even though construction in our cities have increased. So again, taking into consideration the paucity of time, the paucity of money, the fact that we were like doing interviews back to back. I got a list of 25 cement suppliers in Kenya. Did I have the time to chase all of them? No, I went and spoke to 3 of them. So we should definitely do follow-up questions. And this is by no measure a generalization, but a tidbit we sort of found in the field. Thank you.
I think short point in this is, well, my first comment, the very fine line between spying and research. No, I think we've had a very interesting discussion. I'll repeat what I said at the beginning. This is an extremely important beginning. You've done a very good job with this. I think you got a lot of ideas and suggestions on how you can actually finalize the report. I was telling Ambassador Khan that, in my view, we should have more recommendations and more conclusions. Not because, I think, and the point is, this is the beginning of a process. And, you'll be doing many more reports. I think it's a very, very good beginning. And I would encourage ICS to do more of this work. And in fact, I would encourage ICWA to do more of this work also. And the others. Because the example of what China is doing is relevant to what India is doing. All the criticism that Chinese companies face, we also face. It's not new, it's going to happen. And our competitors are going to make this point of reference all the time. So whether it's debt or other things, I think we need to bear that in mind. But I'd just like to once again congratulate you for an excellent piece of work done. We wait to see your final report. I hope you share it as much as you can. We'll now move to the second part of this.
Just a moment. What Suri said is absolutely valuable, that it's beginning, we need to do more. And it's exactly what we're going to do. In fact, with this report which focused on Kenya and Tanzania, now we move on to Zambia. So later this year, in fact, we'll do a fieldwork based report on Zambia. And that's how we keep expanding. So we have a nucleus, we expand further on it. Hopefully conclusions will also, recommendations will keep getting refined, fine-tuning the process.
Thank you. I'm glad I said, the more you do on this subject, I think it will be good for all of us, both India and China. Okay, we now move to the second part of this workshop, which is the roundtable discussion. You've seen from the program leaflet in front of you, there are 5 themes for discussion. The themes are India's approach to Africa, influence of the China factor. Second, China's engagement in Africa versus the West. Third, the role of African agency. What is Africa's strategy for engaging India and China? Fourth, experiences of Indian corporates operating in Africa, competing or coexisting with Chinese actors. And finally, Indian contribution to developing African infrastructure. My suggestion is that we have till 1 o'clock, which means another 50 minutes. Once all of you have made your points, I will ask the authors of the report for their comments on this. And if I may, Ambassador, may I ask you to start this discussion? Or is that not fair?
That's not fair.
Okay. I'll ask you to come back onto this, but maybe I'll ask Pramit to start this discussion. Pramit, would you like to start?
That's even more unfair. That's even more unfair.
Usually Africa specialist for Athens, so why not?
That's solely because I lived in Africa for many years, not because I've actually studied it. But I'll just say a couple of points based on what I've heard. I haven't actually had a chance to see this report per se.
No, moving
on to the bigger picture. Okay. Well, I think what is important about reports like this, and this goes to what a lot of people have been saying, we actually have very little knowledge, especially on the financial aspects in infrastructure development. And as has been everybody's mentioning, Africa is a continent, and within Africa the variation
is growing. Is there any correlation to development? And how much of the debt is Chinese? And one last point. There are 1 million Chinese now operating as entrepreneurs in China. When we tend to think of Chinese projects, we are focusing largely on the SOEs and large companies. This kind of comes out in our narrative. But what about these 1 million entrepreneurial folk? And there are a lot of narratives about them. Even the FT had a very detailed story about a Nigerian project. Now, do these companies seek profit or not? I think these small enterprises would not have the cash flow to continue indefinitely delaying profit. So how are they doing it? I think perhaps some investigation there might be very useful in the longer run. And the role of India-China cooperation in Africa has, I think it was touched upon, Ambassador Suri mentioned it. What is the scope there in terms of marrying the two countries' resources together? We seem to be here caught up largely in a narrative of competition rather than looking at avenues of cooperation. For example, we know Government of India's view on BRI, but what is Government of India's view, for example, in Indian companies participating in Chinese projects? Even if they don't have a view on paper, Indian businessmen are very sensitive to not crossing government's view, even if it's not written but just implied. I think some of these undercurrents need to be looked at also. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add to what he was mentioning about Sinoshore. That's very interesting.
Come here. Just get it in. Yeah.
So Sinoshore actually can be a very good proxy to study engagement in Africa because most of these SOEs don't move a finger without Sinoshore financing, insurance. And anecdotally, for example, Sinoshore's outlook on Pakistan is that they're willing to take 90% commercial risk cover on projects, which is CPEC. And in India, it's close to 50%. Now, because Sinashore is making losses, it's very difficult for them to justify this difference. Because any insurance company will look at stuff like the legal system, how easy it is to invoke guarantees and enforce contracts. So that could be a very good point to, like a sort of thumb rule to see how they are choosing these projects. Because I'm guessing it is more closer to Pakistan, what Sinosure will insure in Africa. rather than 50%, because that is 50% is really low. If Cynosure only can ensure 50%, very few SOEs will volunteer for projects like this. So if you could get on to some data from Cynosure about which project they're ensuring in Africa, because these are all done projects. I don't think it's that sensitive. It should be visible either in Cynosure's financial statements, or some of these people you have interviewed, they might be able to even informally tell you how much percentage of insurance cover that Cynosure has given. And this is something that can add tremendous value to your project, because that will tell you what is the determinant of selection of these projects, and how does China look at it. Because if there's going to be any change in the stance, again this will be covered in Cynosure's stance towards these projects. So 2 years from now, if projects in one particular country or projects of a particular type are not working to China's benefit, 2 years from now Cynosure will change its appetite for these projects. So I think that's why it will give you like a theme to follow.
That's a good direction. Ravi, would you like to comment on the bigger issues?
I've been listening to this and I was particularly interested in the financial thing, because I heard some of my friends are involved in financing in Africa, and there's a very interesting thing. Most of them have either been excluded or now no longer find it possible to work with Chinese firms.
Yes, please, Ambassador Charlie.
I do not hold the view that we can in any way give a competition to China, but I would suggest 2 lines of inquiry, if it can be pursued, particularly in the report as well. There are 2 elements which are critical, I feel, in terms of improving our performance in Africa. One is on the financing side, certainly. And we have existing modes of financing, but clearly they are not delivering to the extent they should be. How can we improve them? Keeping in view what the Chinese have done, what others have done. If that could be an important element in the report, that would be very useful, particularly keeping in view also the investment guarantee element, the insurance. Those are, I think, very critical elements which stand in the way of the cost of financing. Is there something that Exim Bank should be doing, which they are not currently doing in terms of mode of financing, etc.? I think it would be very, very important in comparison with other practices. To the extent that even regarding the case studies, if you can draw out something from those other projects and come to some conclusion, that would be useful. The second area where India, I feel, is particularly strong is on technical cooperation, as well as in terms of affording scholarships and so on. Now, this is not in any way related to our commercial involvement in Africa. I would suggest we need to look at closely if we can make some linkages. There are very many training programs that we make. We have also set up institutions in Africa which train people. Now, can they in some ways be related to commercial projects in Africa? We have African students studying in India. Their internships, can they be spent in Indian commercial projects in Africa because the cost of training, if you can bring down for Indian companies operating in Africa through these technical cooperation projects, I think it's something worth exploring. And if you can even make further technical cooperation projects in line with commercial investments there, so that to some extent you discount the cost of investment in Africa, this is something that can be done because we have substantial technical cooperation projects, but to dovetail it with investment. If for example, there is a new industrial estate coming up in Kenya or elsewhere, can we set up an ITI right there with Indian, that can be done through technical cooperation. That will assist training of people, welders, cutters, what have you, skilled people, who can then be used for investments in those industrial estates. This is an element that can be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
I think there's an interesting point what Ambassador Shashaji said, that's for the capacity building initiatives and how do you link up with the projects that is happening. When we look at India, as far as approach is concerned, we have always worked through our strengths and experiences. What I think important is the skill development, which in your presentation you did touch upon, saying they only prefer certain kind of local skills that are taught. But if you look at some of our projects, let's say Tata in Mozambique, Nicole, what they have done is that they are also involved in training programs, sending them back to Dehradun, getting training here and going back. So how to make it's a kind of a learning process for us, how to make our high-tech and other training programs relevant to the priorities and skills that now Africa requires in terms of their growing economy. That is what we are not making a study and assessment, and which firmly I also try to say in many forums, that it's time to look at the kind of skills that we are providing, which India is doing. Is it relevant to their local economy or not? So this is one thing that we need to look at. Second, as far as approaches is concerned, when we took a larger picture, India-China approach remains similar in the South-South framework. Modalities are very different. But when we look up our projects in Africa, you also mentioned about invest all these Chinese construction projects, whether they're related to any investments or not. When we look at our Exim Bank projects being a stepping stone for our private sector getting into Africa, we have also seen a very mixed result. Not everywhere it has come up has been the success story, where in part of Eastern Africa, if you say Tanzania, Kenya, this has hold good, but if you look at in other parts of country where our Exim Bank projects are, it has not led to bringing more Indian FDI over there in Africa. For example, but there are mixed things. If you look at Nigeria and Angola, you find Indian FDI is going there beyond without the Exim Bank. It's only in the eastern part of Eastern Southern Africa where you have Exim Bank related to the FDIs going. So it's even that aspect, our projects has not benefited in terms of our private sector investments going to Africa. So this is also one area where we look at. And when I look at approaches in terms of development sectors that we are looking now with Africa, not in other sectors as well, I find that we are doing a lot in Africa. Every time we have Peter again saying, well, Chinese influence is much more than what. What we are not doing more is basically trying to make an impact assessment about our projects, how it is trying to transform livelihoods there, how it is trying to bring out growth structures over there. And it's time that research should be done. We leave everything to government. I don't think that is possible. It's important that more research should be done by the research institutes in India and Africa and countries concerned to do more impact assessment studies vis-a-vis our projects in Africa to see whether it has led to certain. Yes, in case of Ethiopia, we have done some studies to see how it is related to transform livelihoods over there, particularly the sugar industry. In case of and particularly our rural electrification project in Ethiopia. But I think more and more studies need to see so that we can bring out where we stand vis-a-vis China. Otherwise, always you get a picture that is Chinese influence, India is not doing anything, we're doing substantial things.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, please.
I'm Amit Gupta. I'm an entrepreneur and in meditation. I just have to make one request.
Okay.
We have a considerable number of Indian diaspora living in Africa as a continent, especially in East Africa, the people who migrated a couple of generations ago. we have not mentioned anything about them. They are actually helping the African economy per se in lot of ways. And again, the present government has lot of focus on Indian diaspora. We have not mentioned throughout the discussions, we have not mentioned anything about them. As the ma'am has mentioned that Indian companies are doing lot of things. I'll like to share one example of Airtel. They have acquired the local telecom company and then they are operating through that company there. So a lot of things are being done there. You have mentioned about, it is just a comment, please, I'm not an expert on this subject, but you mentioned about the people who are closing their businesses now. But what are the factors why they are doing it? Since I'm an entrepreneur, I'm into international trade for more than 20 years and I've been traveling across the globe. I don't find any reason, substantial reason why they would close because Chinese are there or Indians are there. Rather, it must be helping them to grow. This is something we can discuss offline, but Indian diaspora part that I would like to mention and request for more comments.
Leave it to that. Yeah, yes, please.
My name is Sagar. I write for International Affairs, and we have seen that a lot of discussions have been going on about the projects in Africa. But the Chinese and Indians companies are very different because Indian companies are run by as a PSU or private sectors, and in Chinese companies they don't have any sort of effectivism. And is the contract is government to government or is it through certain bodies? And what sort of, we all know that Chinese companies do very well because most of their overhead expenditures are really nil and they can start the work because mostly it is owned by the institutions and they're sort of a communist team units. So what are the basic things in getting the contract? The mechanism, and as far as the finance is concerned, a lot has been discussed. But the finance part is governed by the Asian Development Bank and other financial institutions of Asia, where Chinese play a very important role. So it is the Chinese investment in Africa which has got little or a frugal investment in the order. So how far Chinese companies can get the aid revert back to them is also a very big question. Because investing without getting the return, I suppose it's a very murky affair, and how far they are getting into this, the entire question has to be probed. Thank you.
Thank you. The question of how you define return.
I just had a query. We discussed about the important role of state in supporting activities of Chinese companies in Africa, especially Tanzania and Kenya, role of Exim Bank, how most of the projects are actually loan-based rather than coming through FDI-linked investment there. There's another major actor there, that is Chinese immigrants, those who migrated, million-strong Chinese migrants to Africa. Request the panel to talk a little bit about what kind of role they are playing in Kenya and Tanzania in driving Chinese engagement with these two specific countries and more broadly with Africa. There's a whole book, as you know, Howard French's book on China's second continent. That aspect, if you could discuss a little bit.
Okay, I think what we'll do now is that I'll request each of the panelists to take 5 minutes each to comment on the bigger issues. Don't focus on your project, we've done enough project, the bigger 5 thematic issues which are give us your comments on that. And then at the end I'm going to give a very few general remarks on what I believe should be our position on these things, and then we'll close the session.
Can you quickly respond to some?
Yeah, you do that also, but I'd like you to also look at the bigger picture now. Not just this, but please go ahead.
The Chinese diaspora, so I'll sort of start from the end to the beginning. That was very interesting because some of the contractors that we had met, they did not even speak English when they had first come to Africa. So they learned English in, like for instance, in Kenya. So some of the gentlemen we spoke to had very heavy Kenyan accents. And it was very interesting because their families grew up there and they had no intention of going back to China. And some of them told me that, we have a much better quality of life in Kenya. Like as one mentioned, I have a driver, I have a cook, I have a chef and all of that. But then some of them were also very quick to point out and say that, but I'm going to make sure my kids leave quickly to China to my parents. And you ask them why, and they're like, because she's talking Swahili and she doesn't speak any Chinese and, she has to grow up as a Chinese kid. So I think while the Indian diaspora, it's been there for many generations, I think the Chinese diaspora is relatively new on account. And why did we include the Indian diaspora? Because this was largely a report that was trying to understand Chinese, functioning in these two regions. That said, Ambassador Kanta had connected me to the high commissions in both Kenya and Tanzania and made it a point to tell me to go, see them first. And they immediately connected me to members of the Indian diaspora who were active. So for instance, they were keeping track of us and sort of helping us through the entire process, from booking us cabs to making sure we were happy and we were safe and all of that. So that support, in the form of a support system, they sort of existed. They even offered to make me idli and sambar at some point because they thought I would get, I would miss home food. And ma'am, Nivedita ma'am, your point about capacity building, which even Ambassador Sheshadri brought up. For the longest time, I know we've talked about capacity building being India's USP. But also, I think China has been sort of scaling up on that front. There are a lot of Confucius Institute scholarships and also Chinese government scholarships for African students to come study in China. For instance, when I was a student at Peking University, in my flow, there were students from like Cabo Verde, Cote d'Ivoire, Zambia, Sudan, and sometimes you'd be sitting in a room and realize none of us are from the same country. So even Gomera and I met through another African student from Zimbabwe who's a student at Peking University. So the School of Government, for instance, has a lot of officials and bureaucrats who are from different African countries, different ministries, being trained in China. And this was brought up again in a lot of these projects. They told us that they do send teams to China for training and back. Talking about the larger question, and also sir, you mentioned you mentioned that African countries they're not geopolitically too much of a priority for China. I don't know, I would like to sort of push that argument a little bit because, for instance, when you look at the VRI, right, I feel like African nations are very important in pushing the narrative of the benign VRI. If you look at the conversations that are coming out of the continent, when there is pushback from the West or other areas about what CPEC means and what VRI could do, a lot of African countries have come out and said, no, it's not so bad, it's good, and we welcome it. And also the question of the UNSC board, the One China policy, pushing the One China policy. I think recently South Oman Principe pulled up, started recognizing Beijing. And I think 2 weeks later they announced a deep water port there. So I don't know how much that argument would fly. And another thing about the Indian development model for Africa, right? For instance, the Exim Bank report, which when you read it, it makes sense because we seem to understand where the gap lies, that Indian infrastructure companies have global experience, that they should be active in Africa, they have all these assets in Africa, and how we can further it. The Kukuza development project sort of strongly lays out these are the way forward and we can find ways in which we can cooperate with Chinese actors on the ground. However, when you look at implementation, I don't think so much has happened on that front, and I don't know why that is. And there's a Hausa proverb that I keep using in my presentations and I really like, and it says that when the music changes, the dance must too. And I think when it comes to Chinese engagement in Africa, you might like it, you might not like it, you might have strong feelings about it, but the point is they've really changed the rules of engagement in the continent and they've really provided an alternate model to traditional models.
Thank you. Let me just mention that for my master dissertation, my topic was to understand what the impact of debt relief initiative that was part of the World Bank project, to see whether this kind of project has helped African countries. So to have a fiscal space and how they can translate the fiscal space into other socioeconomic activities. So finally, it turns out that the effect of debt relief was positive, and the impact of debt to the growth of the African economy was negatively correlated. So the issues of debt sustainability, like what is now is happening for China, that there's a lot of outside comments about the China debt sustainability and Africa. So I think this all goes back to what the World Bank did last time. So I think as much as China is also trying to help Africa in terms of financing long-term projects, because most of the long-term projects are they're more risky and more uncertain. So financing these projects is a part of the how we can like African agencies, they can take part in that process, how they can equip themselves, like most of the African countries, how they can equip themselves in order to at least to accrue the benefit of this large or mega infrastructure project. But looking at the political economy aspect, most of African countries are democratic countries, so to say. So issues of politics cannot be separated from the economic perspective. For example, taking back to what in Twara gas pipeline was implemented during that time. So we asked this responsible official from the ministry. He was saying at that time we're going to the next general election. So the project was one of the determining factor on how to evaluate the activities of the government at that time. So the issue of political economy and the role of African agencies is also critical. So this is what I can comment on.
Yeah, I think we raised a lot of really interesting questions here, especially when you talk about the nature, they have different standard with another interest company. I think it's really interesting about that. So I want to share some facts. It may helpful for your questions. The first, one of the people talking about the data. If Africa, who have loaned the most money to Africa, I cannot say speak for the Africans because there are 54 countries, but I do read the report released by the Kenya government. Actually, for Kenya, even we have the 3.8 billion ICS projects, but the biggest donor is not China. It's Africa Bank, AFDB, and the World Bank. China is the third one. That's the fact I want to share. And another thing, I think one of you guys talking about the entrepreneur. So actually from the report we can see released on 2017. So they claim in Africa more Chinese private company than state-owned company. I won't say I disagree with them, but I think they are a little bit rushed to the conclusion because we don't have exactly number how many SOE and how many private company in Africa. But there is the things like when Chinese companies, state-owned company, for example like CCCC, they prefer use the suppliers they use in China. Then the suppliers in China, they realize that there is an opportunity in Africa, and then they can come to Africa, and they are a private company. So I think it might choose the more private Chinese companies in Africa, because the state-owned company only one, but they may have like 10 private company suppliers back of them. So that's the second fact I want to share. And the third thing, we talk about the segment companies. Actually, I have meeting many Chinese entrepreneurs too. They share the same problem. For example, like the first, they are doing the trade in Africa, and they realize like Kenya government may have a better manufacturing policy. If I build a plant here, I may make more money. It's profitable driven to make them, okay, I set a factory here and manufacture luggage, just say that. And then I realize the market is like limited. There are only 40 million population here. They only need this kind of the luggage. Even I manufacture more, I cannot make more money. So that's the problem Veda talking about the cement. So the Kenya, the home market, they only need this amount of the cement. But there are more than 35 cement companies in this market. That's why they are they're dying. As the first thing. And second thing, I have interviewed the biggest cinema companies, which is the Kenya owned companies. He shared with me like the cement is still very raw material in construction. They prefer to sell the concrete, but the Chinese they think they make the concrete better than local. That's why they only purchase cement from local, but they still make their concrete by themselves by using this cement. So that's also the different perspective. But this is different perspective because the Chinese company think the local cannot make quality enough concrete for them, but the local think they are ready. It's also the mixed perspective. That's what I want to say.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to, before we end, make a few general remarks. Comment the point you made about the Chinese now wanting international banks and institutions to be much greater part of BRI. I think had the Chinese gone about the BRI in a sensible way, if you look at the basic white paper of March 2015, that was the intention from the very beginning. But they went about it like a bull in a china shop. Either you do it my way or I'm not. And so the problem is they have now committed so many mistakes in addition to whatever good things they've done. And insofar as Africa is concerned, I think, I said before you came, these mistakes have been acknowledged, of course, not in so many words, but in terms of the changes required in the FOCAC decisions of September last year. And I very clearly elaborated over there. As I said earlier, it's a question of how they are implemented. We'll see how that happens. Because BRI cannot proceed in the manner it was intended without third-party involvement and third-country financing. China will simply not finance it. It's as simple as that. So we must understand that. As far as Africa is concerned, Africa is now formally on board on BRI. This was also agreed in the FOCAC document. And we will see actually how in the VRI summit, which is going to happen in Beijing soon, how actual changes will take place in terms of policies, financing, technology transfers, skilling, etc. I think it will all get spelled out. We'll see how that one goes. Now, as far as the themes for today's roundtable are concerned, I think India's approach to Africa influences the China factor. Look, obviously every big country influences every other big country. But India's engagement in Africa is far older than China's engagement in Africa, even on economic and other aspects. The only major Chinese involvement in the 60s was the Tazara railway, which was a disaster. It was built for the wrong reasons. When I was posted in Dar es Salaam, the Tazara stations were always empty, there was no train there. So, but China has learned from those mistakes. So I have never seen, as a person who handled the policy aspect, being particularly influenced by the China factor. We are in two different realms in Africa. And there is enough space in Africa for us all to be there. Now, I said in my earlier remarks also, the biggest advantage for Africa is that it now has alternatives. It has China, it has India, it has Turkey, it has Russia, it has Brazil, it has other countries. So, I think today's situation for African countries is much better than it was 20-25 years ago. They have alternatives to look at. And there again, I think as Ravi said, cost and delivery becomes very important. And from our perspective, the most important thing is do our projects, do our development cooperation suggestions fit in with local requirements and plans. That has been our bottom line and will remain our bottom line. I think I've covered the question of China's engagement in Africa versus the rest. I think, yes, I think Professor mentioned it, others have also mentioned it. The traditional donors are not happy with the competition. Why would they be? And I think this is the reality. The traditional donors have to change their ways. I mean, if the World Bank is going to change its ways, and the IMF is going to change its ways, they also have to change their ways. Now, why does everybody have to go and adhere to DAC norms? There is a new norm setting underway, and that is part of the whole process of change. And this new norm setting is what is critical now. Today, we've been talking about South-South cooperation for 50 plus years. It didn't work in the past because the oil producing countries did not contribute anything to the South. Today, the South, non-oil producing South, has enormous resources at its disposal. I mean, enormous in inverted commas because obviously it's not as much as we would like it to be. But on top of that, you now have the oil producing countries who are joining the Southern Bank. They're not investing all their money in the Western finance institutions. They're not putting money in projects. All these big oil producing countries now have development funds which are now investing very wisely. So there is more option for not just Africa but for everybody else, and I think that's a good thing. So norms will change, rule setting will change, and we have to be part of the process of norm setting. Experience of Indian corporates, I think this is, as I said, next time if you have a broader participation by industry, that would be helpful. But I think the important thing is, I said it earlier also, there is a time will come sooner rather than later, I think, when Indian and Chinese companies will start collaborating more and more as our partners in African projects. Not simply as part of multilateral financing, but in terms of tendering for local projects, because there are capacities available. You have now Indian companies which have become African companies, and so do Chinese companies. I see this happening much more among Chinese private companies and Indian companies than investments coming from or projects being undertaken by Chinese SOEs. So their whole decision-making process is different. So I'll stop at that, and I think I'd only like to thank all of you for a very interesting discussion. I think we've had essentially, that is his part. I'm finishing my part. So we've had a very interesting and I think positive discussion, which I'm very happy to see. And again want to congratulate the authors for beginning work on a very interesting and very important project. I think may you have more strength to your elbow and do much more of this work. Next time I would say to you, do it country-wise. Either you do East African community as a whole, not just do Tanzania and Kenya, or do it country-wise because you'll find that more profitable in terms of outcomes. And my recommendation, final recommendation again to you is, do not have conclusions, have recommendations. Not just for what is happening on the ground, but also in terms of future work. Because then you are being positive, because I don't think the objective of this report was to be negative, of this study. So we are not here to further strengthen existing narratives which are perhaps negative. You have to look at this in the context of a broader South-South cooperation process. Because unless you do that, there is obviously competition. It's not easy to divorce the two. But we have to build this South-South narrative, because the South today has the ability to do things it did not have even 10 years ago. So we have to now learn from our experiences, mistakes, experiences, and take it forward. So it remains me to thank you all for a very fascinating discussion, and to Ashok for inviting me to chair this session. My part of the session is now concluded. Over to Sanjay.
Thank you, sir. Let me at the outset state that it's a very bold and courageous of all the three authors to open up to public scrutiny of their research work. It's not easy, and I would say that you should take the solutions with a pinch of salt, or sometimes fistful of salt. Why? Because we come up with our own different approaches and our own training. I'm a political scientist, so I'll ask you, when I look at the connectivity projects that you're looking at, like a political scientist, I'll ask, are Chinese preferring certain ethnic communities in a given country when they're operationalizing connectivity projects? That is an important question. How are these connectivity projects impacting ethnic relations in a given country? Because African countries are multi-ethnic countries. But as a political scientist, that is a question that I'll ask. For that, you have to become an expert in ethnic politics of Tanzania and Kenya. And it will take, if you take all these suggestions, sometimes it may take you 5 to 10 years, and probably you need to get a contract for 5 to 10 years of work, which is good. But point is, there is a menu of suggestions that have come. You can pick and choose from those things. The second point again is there has been a lot of response that I noted on the econometric equation that you have placed on the table. With the exception of one or two people here, none of us cannot even read that econometric equation. So our response to your equation has been a general criticism of econometric modeling itself. So there are two ways when a model is placed on the table you respond. One is your work consistent within the model? Or the second way of looking at it is critiquing the model itself. So what you have been given is critiquing the model itself. So if you want somebody to comment on the econometric equation that you have placed on the table, we are the wrong audience. In a way we are also right, because we also help you look at the model from a macro perspective. So probably you need to check it with some econometric experts on that. One of the things that comes, the challenges that you have endured, I can fully understand. For instance, what are the consequences of connectivity spread over a period of time? I wanted to do the same thing to one of the Indian neighbors, and I realized that they don't have census data. So how do you go about it? So I wanted to do a socio-economic impact of connectivity projects in Indian neighborhood. There is no census data, there is no HDA indicators. So how do I study? So you need to come up with proxy variables to look at it. And that's where the suggestions that you got today will help you a lot. With the series, the large menu of proxy variables were suggested. The challenges that you might have endured, I can fully empathize. In my instance, the boundaries of the data changes, the districts were reconstituted, the provincial territories were reconstituted. So all these things you will have to deal with. One of the other things that I noticed during the discussion was the discussion on how is China approaching profit through investments. That is a very interesting dynamic that I noticed. For instance, Gumera and others, and all of you have suggested that probably they are not taking a project-oriented approach. They are looking more in terms of making a presence felt in their market and having a long-term stay, and therefore benefiting from the long-term economic engagement. It requires sustained state support with the Chinese companies who are receiving. But as Pramit pointed out, that probably that is also falling apart in the sense that he pointed out that the China may be considering abandoning certain projects. So this whole issue of profitability requires far detailed study. And as Ravi was pointing out, Mr. Bhutalingam, in terms of financing, there is a need for developing a marketplace of models, as he pointed out, the restaurant menu kind of approach to understanding what are the best finance models that are available and countries can choose. And of course, other issues such as capacity building and India's technical cooperation and making it locally relevant, all these issues were touched upon. The issue of diaspora was also mentioned. And there are questions there to what extent and with what intensity should we engage diaspora in economic activities given the ethnic politics that are there in those countries. That is something that can be reflected upon. But at a larger level, it is interesting that the study is about an Indian perspective, which means that we have co-opted Gumera and Tongwu into an Indian perspective. Or the other way of looking at it is probably we have joined your perspective and calling it an Indian perspective. That's another way of looking at it. And the title says Chinese engagement, whether it is economic, political, cultural, probably there is a need for subtitle there that can be reflected upon. But coming back to this, because an Indian, a Chinese and a Tanzanian are looking at Chinese data and data from Africa and trying to give an Indian perspective or one perspective, it's a significant challenge that we are looking at. And those of you who had any doubts about globalization, you can put them to sleep and join us for a sumptuous lunch. Over to you, Veda.
Thank you. I would request you all to bear with me because this is going to be slightly long. Because, like he said, we've had to navigate a couple of hoops to put this together. So to begin with, when as researchers, Africa isn't probably the hot topic you want to study in India. So when you try and pitch a project and you say you want to study Africa, you want to study Chinese actors, and you want Chinese researchers on board and African researchers on board, and you want to go in the field and you want to do field work and you want to do all of this within 1 year, not everyone will say, yeah, sure, go ahead. But ICS did. So I think I should start my vote of thanks by thanking Patricia ma'am, Mohanty sir, a lot of the senior faculty who are here, adjunct fellows, honorary fellows in ICS, who were from the get-go thought that this was a great idea and I should just keep going ahead. And especially I'd like to thank Ambassador Kanta. And I'm not saying this because he's here. Like even before I joined ICS, I told him this and he really was like, from the get-go, from getting me connected to missions, making sure I was safe when I was in the field, to pulling strings when Gomera couldn't get his visa, he's been throughout, he's been a constant presence. So thank you, sir. This is for in ICS, if you know ICS, it's a small team and it's really been all hands on deck. Madhurima Nandi, our assistant director, was very helpful in navigating the administrative tasks. Sharing helped print, make the program and design it. Our young colleague Prarthana designed the banner. So thank you to all the ICS colleagues, Gunjan who's here, thank you. NMML were very easy co-hosts. Sanjay, thank you, but also big thank you to Shakti sir. I presented, after I moved to Delhi, my first presentation on my PhD findings was in this exact room. Shakti sir invited me to the Mandala dialogue, so thank you very much for having us here again. The admin team in ICS and in NMML were very critical in putting all of these things in under 48 hours together. Very efficient team, so thanks to them. I'd also like to thank our partners in Africa, SACE Boto, who navigated the fieldwork in Kenya, and also REPOA in Tanzania. ISEC Fukuo and Dr. Donald Mari, very helpful throughout the entire process. I'd also like to thank, I don't need to, I know, but I still need to thank you guys, because I've given them really hard timelines. When it came to writing, we had interviews at 7 in the morning, 11 p.m. Not once did these guys complain. We went back to back at it, so thank you very much. I'd also like to just thank our research assistant, Sunaina, Uday. They made sure that before we went into every interview, we got company briefs that told us everything that is out there open source about that company, so we walked in informed, semi-informed. And also with writing of the report, they've taken huge chunks of the report and they've written it, so thanks to them. And most importantly, like you can see in the study, our focus wasn't on Indian stakeholders. So the reason we wanted this, because for this entire 1 year, these projects existed in our heads. We've had many heated debates about a lot of these things. We wanted to sort of share it with people and sort of get a sense of where we were going with it. And I'm not saying this because again I have to, but a lot of what came out of today's discussions is going to inform the final report. So thank you all very much. I know you all have you're all very busy people, but thank you for taking the time, thank you for showing the patience, and thank you for sharing with us your comments and insights. It's made the report much better. Thank you.
Please join us for lunch.